Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. I wish you folks all the best in 2026. With that said, let's jump into today's stories. Starting off, we have the shadows of Pine Ridge. South Dakota, 1975. The heat of the South Dakota summer in 1975 was more than just atmospheric. It was political, social, and deeply volatile. On the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, the air didn't just shimmer with the sun. It felt heavy with the weight of a century of broken promises and a more recent, simmering civil war. If you were to drive down the dusty roads near the village of Oglala in late June, you wouldn't just see the breathtaking, rugged beauty of the Badlands. You would see federal agents in unmarked cars, checkpoints manned by armed locals, and a community divided by a line in the dirt that grew deeper with every passing day. To understand what happened on the afternoon of June 26th, you have to understand the powder keg that Pine Ridge had become. For years, the reservation had been split between the traditionalists, supported by the American Indian Movement, or AAM, and the tribal government led by Dick Wilson. Wilson's critics called his private militia the guardians of the Oglala Nation, or goons, and accused them of using violence and intimidation to silence dissent. By 1975, the murder rate on the reservation was higher than almost anywhere else in the United States. It was into this environment that two young FBI agents drove their vehicles on a Tuesday morning, looking for a single man wanted for the theft of a pair of cowboy boots. They had no idea they were driving into a historical flashpoint. Special agents Jack Kohler and Ronald Williams were young, both in their late 20s. Williams was known for his easygoing nature, while Kohler was a former police officer with a young family. They were in separate cars, trailing a red pickup truck they believed contained a suspect named Jimmy Eagle. As the vehicles moved onto the Jumping Bull Ranch, a sprawling property that served as a camp for AIM members and their families, the situation escalated with terrifying speed. It started with a single shot. To this day, no one is entirely certain who pulled the trigger first, but within seconds, the valley erupted into a cacophony of gunfire. The two agents were pinned down in an exposed area between their vehicles. They were outgunned and outpositioned, facing high-powered rifle fire from the tree line and the ridges above. Williams managed to radio for help, his voice strained over the crackle of the transmission, reporting that they were under heavy fire and were going to be killed if reinforcements didn't arrive immediately. For those in the AIM camp, the sight of the two cars wasn't seen as a routine law enforcement action. In a climate where disappearances and drive-by shootings were common, the arrival of two unidentified vehicles was perceived as an assault. Men, women, and teenagers grabbed their rifles and took positions. Among them was Leonard Peltier, a prominent IM activist who had come to Pine Ridge to help protect the traditionalists from the goon squads. The standoff lasted for hours. The sheer volume of lead flying through the air was staggering. When the dust finally settled and a massive force of federal and tribal officers moved in to reclaim the area, they found a scene of absolute devastation. Both Agent Williams and Agent Kohler were dead. They had been wounded during the long-distance exchange, but the evidence suggested a far more grim conclusion. Both men had been shot at point-blank range while they lay incapacitated. The brutality of the finish transformed a shootout into an execution in the eyes of the federal government. But the agents weren't the only casualties. A young AIM member named Joe Stuntz was also found dead, shot through the head by a sniper. While the deaths of the federal agents triggered one of the largest manhunts in FBI history, the death of Joe Stuntz went almost entirely uninvestigated. It was a disparity that would come to define the controversy of the Immerse case, short for reservation murders, for decades to come. In the aftermath, the Jumping Bull Ranch was swarmed. The FBI brought in helicopters, armored personnel carriers, and hundreds of agents in combat gear. The message was clear. The government was no longer just looking for a boot thief. They were at war. Most of the activists who had been at the scene managed to slip away through the hills under the cover of darkness, beginning a desperate flight from justice that spanned across the country and into Canada. The legal battle that followed was as chaotic as the shootout itself. 4 men were eventually charged with the murders. Leonard Peltier, Dino Butler, Bob Robideau, and Jimmy Eagle. The charges against Eagle were eventually dropped, leaving the other three to face the weight of the Department of Justice. However, the government decided to try them separately, a move that would lead to one of the most glaring contradictions in American legal history. Butler and Robideau were the first to stand trial in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Their defense was built on a single, powerful pillar: self-defense. They argued that because of the atmosphere of terror on the reservation and the unidentified nature of the agents' vehicles, they believed they were being attacked by illegal paramilitaries. The jury listened to testimony about the violence of the goon squads and the FBI's involvement in tribal politics. In a stunning blow to the prosecution, the jury acquitted both men, finding that their participation in the shootout was a justified response to a perceived threat. The government was humiliated. They still had one defendant left, Leonard Peltier, and they were determined not to let him slip through their fingers. By the time Peltier was extradited from Canada and brought to trial in Fargo, North Dakota, the prosecution strategy had shifted. The trial was moved to a more conservative district, and much of the evidence regarding the reign of terror on the reservation that had swayed the Iowa jury was barred from being presented. The centerpiece of the case against Peltier was a shell casing found in the trunk of Agent Kohler's car. The prosecution claimed this casing had been fired from an AR-15 rifle associated with Peltier. They also produced 3 affidavits from a woman named Myrtle Pourbaix, who claimed she was Peltier's girlfriend and had witnessed him kill the agents. It seemed like an open and shut case. Peltier was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. However, almost as soon as the prison doors slammed shut, the foundation of the conviction began to crumble. It was revealed that Myrtle Pourbaix had never actually met Leonard Peltier, and she later confessed that the FBI had coerced her into signing the affidavits by threatening her and her family. The prosecution eventually admitted that they didn't actually know who killed the agents, but argued that Peltier was guilty of aiding and abetting the crime regardless. Then came the issue of the ballistics. Years later, through Freedom of Information Act requests, defense attorneys discovered a teletype from an FBI ballistics expert. The document, which had been withheld during the trial, stated that the rifle attributed to Peltier had been tested against the casing found at the scene, and the results were negative. The primary piece of physical evidence linking him to the execution-style shots was, at best, inconclusive and, at worst, fabricated. Despite these revelations, every appeal for a new trial has been denied. The Resmers case has become a symbol of something much larger than a single afternoon of violence. To the FBI and the families of the fallen agents, Leonard Peltier is a cold-blooded killer who escaped the initial dragnet and deserves to stay behind bars. To his supporters, which include international human rights organizations, Nobel Peace Prize winners, and millions of people across the globe, he is a political prisoner, a man who was convicted using tainted evidence and used as a scapegoat for the government's own failures on the reservation. The Pine Ridge Reservation today still carries the scars of 1975. The reign of terror eventually faded, but the underlying issues of poverty, sovereignty, and justice remain. Every year, activists gather to remember Joe Stuntz, the third man who died that day, whose name is often lost in the headlines. They also gather to call for clemency for Peltier, who is now an elderly man in failing health, having spent nearly half a century in a maximum security cell. The debate over what really happened at the bottom of that hill continues to rage. Was it a coordinated ambush or a tragic misunderstanding fueled by fear? Was Leonard Peltier the triggerman or a convenient target for a frustrated agency? While the legal files may be closed, the case remains one of the most polarizing chapters in the history of the American West. A reminder that sometimes justice is as elusive as the shadows in the Badlands. Next story, the DeFeo family murders. Amityville, New York, 1974. The suburbs of Long Island in the mid-70s were the physical embodiment of the American dream. Manicured lawns, quiet streets, and a sense of safety that felt impenetrable. But in the village of Amityville, at 112 Ocean Avenue, stood a grand, three-story Dutch colonial house with two quarter-moon windows on the top floor that looked, to some, like watchful eyes. On the night of November 13th, 1974, those eyes bore witness to a sequence of events that would transform a family home into the most notorious crime scene in American history. At approximately 6:30 p.m., a 23-year-old man named Ronald Butch DeFeo Jr. burst into Henry's Bar, a local neighborhood haunt just a few blocks from his home. He was disheveled, gasping for air, and his voice was thick with panic. He screamed to the patrons that someone had shot his parents. A small group of men, sensing the genuine terror in his voice, followed him back to the house on the water. When they entered the home, the silence was heavy. The air was still. They climbed the stairs to the second floor and entered the primary bedroom. There, they found Ronald DeFeo Sr. and his wife, Louise, lying face down in their bed. Both had been shot. The men didn't wait to see more. They called the authorities immediately. When the Suffolk County Police arrived and began a room-by-room search, the scale of the tragedy grew exponentially. It wasn't just the parents. In the neighboring bedrooms, they found the bodies of the four younger DeFeo children: 18-year-old Dawn, 13-year-old Allison, 12-year-old Mark, and 9-year-old John Matthew. All six victims were found in the same position, lying on their stomachs, face down in their beds, seemingly caught in the middle of a deep sleep. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs that anyone had heard the shots, and most puzzlingly, there were no signs that any of the victims had been drugged or restrained. In a house where six people were killed with a high-powered .35 caliber Marlin rifle, a weapon that produces a thunderous crack, not a single neighbor reported hearing a thing. Even the family dog, a sheepdog named Shaggy, had remained quiet. As the investigation began, Butch DeFeo, the sole survivor, initially played the role of the grieving, terrified son. He told detectives that he believed a mob hitman, a man he named as Louis Fellini, had entered the house to take out his father due to a personal vendetta. Butch claimed he had been at work and then out with friends, only discovering the bodies when he returned home late that evening. But the police were skeptical. Butch's story began to fray at the edges almost immediately. Forensics indicated that the murders had likely occurred around 3 a.m., a time when Butch claimed to have been home. Furthermore, detectives found an empty gun box for a .35 caliber Marlin rifle in Butch's room. The interrogation lasted for hours. Butch was a man known for a volatile temper, a history of substance abuse, and a deeply fractured relationship with his father, who was reportedly a domineering and sometimes abusive man. As the pressure from the investigators mounted, Butch's mob hit story collapsed. He eventually leaned back, took a breath, and uttered the words that would seal his fate. Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast. He confessed to the systematic elimination of his entire family. He described moving from room to room in the dead of night, the heavy rifle in his hands, ending the lives of his parents and then his siblings one by one. But even with the confession, the how and the why remained shrouded in a darkness that many felt transcended simple criminal motive. During the trial in 1975, Butch's defense attorney, William Weber, attempted to mount an insanity defense. He claimed that Butch was hearing voices that commanded him to kill, voices that told him his family was plotting against him. Weber argued that Butch was in a state of dissociative hallucination. The prosecution, however, painted a much more calculated picture. They argued that Butch was a cold-blooded opportunist who killed his family to collect on a substantial life insurance policy. They highlighted his behavior after the murders. He had showered, changed his clothes, discarded the evidence in a storm drain, and then went to work as if it were any other Wednesday. He even made several phone calls to his home throughout the day, pretending to be frustrated that no one was answering, all to build an alibi. The jury ultimately sided with the prosecution. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, eventually passing away in 2021. But while the legal case was closed, the legend of 112 Ocean Avenue was only just beginning. The DeFeo murders left behind a vacuum of unanswered questions that the public was eager to fill. The most haunting aspect remained the physical evidence. How did one man kill 6 people with a loud, bolt-action rifle without anyone waking up or trying to run? In December 1975, 13 months after the murders, George and Kathy Lutz moved into the house with their 3 children. They knew the history. The house had been sold at a bargain price because of the tragedy, but they viewed it as a dream home they could finally afford. They stayed for exactly 28 days. The stories they told upon fleeing the house. Claims of black bile dripping from walls, swarms of flies in the dead of winter, cold spots, and terrifying apparitions turned the DeFeo tragedy into the Amityville horror. The Lutz's account became a best-selling book and a blockbuster film, cementing the image of the house as a portal to something malevolent. Skeptics have long pointed out that the Lutz's claims were likely a financial fabrication. William Weber, DeFeo's own lawyer, later admitted that he and the Lutz's had created this horror story over many bottles of wine in hopes of securing a new trial for Butch by proving that demonic forces could influence a person's actions. However, even if you strip away the Hollywood ghosts and the supernatural claims, the true crime remains profoundly disturbing. When investigators looked at the autopsy reports, they found something that defied logic. None of the children had been moved. There were no defensive wounds. It was as if a heavy shroud of silence had fallen over the house that night, preventing the screams of one victim from reaching the ears of the next. There have been countless theories over the decades. Some suggest Butch had an accomplice, perhaps his sister Dawn, and that he turned on her at the end. This would explain how 2 people could be controlled simultaneously, but ballistic evidence never conclusively supported a second shooter. Others suggest the family was drugged at dinner, but toxicology reports came back clean. The DeFeo case is a rare instance where part of the true crime is often overshadowed by the folklore that followed. People visit Amityville today to see the haunted house, often forgetting that the driveway they are standing in was once a path for 6 coffins. The tragedy wasn't a haunting. It was the total disintegration of a family unit at the hands of one of its own. In the years following his conviction, Butch DeFeo changed his story dozens of times. In some versions, Dawn was the mastermind. In others, his mother was the one who started the killings, and he simply finished it. He became a master of manipulation, playing on the public's obsession with the supernatural to keep his name in the headlines. But the facts that remain are the ones found in the cold, clinical files of the Suffolk County Police Department. 6 people went to sleep in their beds on a cold November night, trusting in the walls of their beautiful home to keep them safe. They were betrayed by the one person who should have been their protector. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue still stands today. Its address has been changed to discourage onlookers, and those famous quarter-moon windows have been replaced with traditional rectangular ones. It has been owned by several families since the Lutzes, none of whom have reported any paranormal activity. The evil that resided there on that night in 1974 didn't come from the ground or the walls. It came from a young man with a rifle and a heart full of resentment. Next story, the 16th Street Baptist Street Church bombing. Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. In the early morning hours of September 15, 1963, the city of Birmingham was already heavy with the heat of a late southern summer. But there was a different kind of tension thick in the air, a static you could almost feel on your skin. For years, this city had earned a dark, rhythmic nickname, Bombingham. It wasn't a metaphor. Between 1947 and 1965, over 50 racially motivated explosions had rocked the city, targeting the homes and gathering places of those who dared to dream of a different world. On this particular Sunday, the 16th Street Baptist Church was the heart of that dream. It was more than just a place of worship. It was a sanctuary, a meeting hall, and a staging ground for the movement that was currently shaking the foundations of the American South. Inside the church, the atmosphere was a mix of Sunday morning routine and youthful energy. It was Youth Day, a special service where the children of the congregation took the lead. In the basement ladies' lounge, 5 young girls were doing what girls have done for generations before a big event. They were adjusting their Sunday best, checking their hair in the mirrors, and talking about the things that matter most when you are 14 or 11 or 9. Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, and Carol Robertson, all 14 years old, were there. Joining them was 11-year-old Carol Denise McNair. Addie's younger sister, Sarah, was also in the room, watching the older girls prepare. They were dressed in white from head to toe, symbols of innocence in a city that had very little left to offer them. Denise McNair asked Addie to tie the sash on her dress. It was a mundane, beautiful moment of sisterhood. At precisely 10:22 a.m., the world as they knew it ceased to exist. The explosion didn't just break the silence. It shattered the very structure of the building. Somewhere between 15 and 20 sticks of dynamite, equipped with a primitive timing device, had been planted beneath the church steps, directly adjacent to the basement lounge. The force was catastrophic. It blew a hole 7 feet wide through the church's rear wall. It sent stones and mortar flying like shrapnel. In the main sanctuary upstairs, the floor heaved. The stained glass windows, depicting scenes of peace and divinity, exploded inward. In one of the most haunting details of the day, every figure in the windows was destroyed except for the face of Christ. Through the dust and the sudden, vacuum-like silence that follows a blast, the screams began. Men and women stumbled through the rubble, their clothes torn, their faces masked in gray soot and blood. Many thought it was a direct hit from a plane or a natural disaster. But as the smoke cleared, the focus shifted to the basement. Sarah Collins was found first, blinded and buried under debris, but alive. Her sister Addie, along with Cynthia, Carol, and Denise, were not so lucky. They were found huddled together beneath the fallen masonry. The sash Addie had been tying for Denise was likely the last thing they felt. The news of the bombing hit Birmingham like a second explosion. As word spread that 4 children had been killed in a house of God, the static that had been building for months finally snapped. Thousands of black residents gathered at the scene, their grief turning into a righteous, desperate fury. The police arrived in riot gear, and by the end of the day, 2 more black youths would be dead. One shot by police, another by a white mob. The city was a powder keg that had finally lost its lid. But while the streets burned, a much slower, more agonizing process was beginning. The search for justice. Almost immediately, the FBI moved in. They were led by a local office that, at the time, was under the immense pressure of a changing national tide. It didn't take long for the investigators to find their way to a specific group of men. These weren't strangers to the authorities. They were members of the United Klans of America, specifically a splinter group known as the Cahaba Boys. They were known for their extremism, even by the standards of the Klan. The primary suspects were 4 men: Robert Dynamite Bob Chambliss, Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr., Herman Frank Cash, and Bobby Frank Cherry. Chambliss was the ringleader. His nickname wasn't a coincidence. He was a man who lived and breathed explosives, a man who viewed the integration of Birmingham schools as an act of war. Within weeks of the bombing, witnesses came forward. One woman, Chambliss's own niece, would later testify that he had told her he had enough stuff to flatten the city. Another witness claimed to have seen a car matching Chambliss's at the church in the pre-dawn hours of that Sunday. The evidence was there, or at least the trail was. But in 1963 Alabama, the legal system was a mirror of the society it served. The FBI's investigation, codenamed Bat Bomb, was remarkably thorough for its time. They collected over 9,000 pages of evidence. They identified the suspects. They knew who had done it. And then the investigation stopped. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, famously blocked the prosecution. He claimed that the chances of a conviction in the current climate were remote and refused to share the Bureau's files with local or state prosecutors. To Hoover, the civil rights movement was often viewed with as much suspicion as the people attacking it. For 14 years, the case sat in a drawer, for families were left to celebrate holidays with empty chairs, watching the men they knew had killed their daughters walk the streets of Birmingham as free men. It wasn't until 1971 that the tide began to turn. A new Alabama Attorney General named Bill Baxley took office. Baxley was a man who had been a student at the University of Alabama when the bombing happened, and the injustice of the Dormant case had stayed with him. He reopened the file, but he found the doors of the FBI still largely closed to him. Baxley didn't give up. He spent years building a case from scratch, leaning on the few witnesses who were still willing to talk and the fragments of evidence that hadn't been lost to time. In 1977, he finally brought Robert Chambliss to trial for the murder of Denise McNair. The courtroom was a time capsule. Witnesses recounted the horror of that Sunday morning. The most damning testimony came from Elizabeth Cobbs, Chambliss's niece, who broke the silence of her family to tell the truth about her uncle's hatred. At 73 years old, Dynamite Bob was finally convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars 8 years later, never showing a shred of remorse. But Chambliss hadn't acted alone. There were 3 other men who had walked away. Decades passed. The 1980s turned into the 1990s. The civil rights era became a chapter in history books rather than a daily headline. Herman Cash died in 1994, taking his secrets to the grave without ever facing a judge. It seemed as though the window for justice had finally slammed shut. However, in the mid-90s, the FBI reopened the case once again. This time, the political and social landscape was unrecognizable compared to 1963. The Bureau began to re-examine their own old files, the ones Hoover had kept hidden. They found recordings and tapes that had never been used. They found that in 1964, the FBI had placed a secret listening device in Thomas Blanton's kitchen. On those tapes, Blanton was heard talking to his wife about the bombing. He spoke about planning the bomb and meeting at the river to discuss the plot. It was the smoking gun that had been buried for over 30 years. In 2001, Thomas Edwin Blanton Jr. was finally brought to trial. He sat in the courtroom, an old man with thinning hair, listening to the voices of his younger self brag about a crime that had shattered the nation. He was found guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life. A year later, in 2002, the final living suspect, Bobby Frank Cherry, faced his day of reckoning. His trial had been delayed due to claims of mental incompetence, but the prosecution proved he was faking his condition. Like Blanton, Cherry was convicted by a jury of his peers. When the final verdict was read, nearly 40 years had passed since that Sunday morning in September. The girls would have been in their 50s. They would have been mothers, perhaps grandmothers. They would have seen the world change in ways they couldn't have imagined from that basement lounge. The 16th Street Baptist Church bombing was a turning point. It was a crime so heinous, so devoid of humanity, that it shocked the conscience of a nation that had been trying to look away. It stripped the glamour of the lost cause from the Klan and revealed them for what they were. People who would kill children to preserve a status quo of hate. It is often said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. In Birmingham, that arc took 4 decades to reach its destination. The church still stands today. The hole in the wall has long been repaired, and the stained glass has been replaced. But if you stand in that basement lounge, you can still feel the weight of what happened there. In the end, the men who planted the dynamite tried to destroy a movement by destroying its children. Instead, they ensured that those 4 girls would live forever in the memory of a country that was forced to grow up because of them. Next story, the murder of Willie Moretti. Cliffside Park, New Jersey, 1951. The morning of October 4th, 1951, began like any other crisp autumn day in the suburbs of New Jersey. In the quiet borough of Cliffside Park, residents were waking up, heading to work, and enjoying the relative peace of a neighborhood known for its orderly streets and respectable neighbors. But at Joe's Elbow Room, a local restaurant nestled on Palisade Avenue, the quiet was about to be shattered by a sound that would echo through the history of the American underworld. Inside a private booth, a man known to both the highest echelons of the mafia and the federal investigators of the Kefauver Committee sat down for a late breakfast. He was flanked by 4 men he considered friends, men he had known for years, men who shared his blood or his secrets. There was no tension in the air, no sense of impending doom. They ordered coffee and eggs. They laughed, and then As the steam rose from their cups, the laughter stopped. Willie Moretti, the powerful underboss of the Genovese crime family and a man whose influence reached from the docks of Jersey to the bright lights of Hollywood, was executed in broad daylight. The shots were heard, but by the time the staff reached the table, the four companions were gone, leaving behind only a cooling breakfast and the lifeless body of a man who simply knew too much. To understand why Willie Moretti had to die in a public restaurant surrounded by his associates, we have to go back to the height of the Prohibition era, when the foundations of the American syndicate were being poured in concrete and blood. Willie Moretti, born Guarino Moretti, was not your average street thug. He was charismatic, talkative, and possessed a level of social grace that made him a favorite among the elite. By the 1930s and 40s, he had established himself as a powerhouse in northern New Jersey. He wasn't just a muscle man, he was a fixer. If you had a problem with a labor union, a gambling debt, or a legal hurdle, Willie was the man you called. He was famously close with Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld. Together, they favored diplomacy over violence whenever possible. Moretti's influence was so vast that he was even credited with helping launch the career of a young singer from Hoboken named Frank Sinatra. Legend has it that when Sinatra wanted out of a restrictive contract with bandleader Tommy Dorsey, it was Moretti who paid Dorsey a visit, armed with a very persuasive suggestion and, as the story goes, a physical reminder of what happens when you say no to the Jersey mob. But while Moretti was living the high life, a silent enemy was beginning to erode his greatest asset, his mind. By the late 1940s, Moretti began displaying erratic behavior. Today, historians and medical experts believe he was suffering from advanced stages of neurosyphilis. In the era before widespread penicillin use, the condition would slowly deteriorate the brain, leading to cognitive decline, grandiosity, and, most dangerously for a man in his profession, an inability to keep secrets. The man who was once known for his sharp wit and strategic silence started talking, and he wouldn't stop. The timing couldn't have been worse. In 1950, the United States Senate established the Special Committee to investigate organized crime in interstate commerce, led by Senator Estes Kefauver. These were the first mob hearings to be televised, bringing the dark underbelly of American life into the living rooms of millions. For the first time, the honored society was being dragged into the light. Most mobsters took the Fifth Amendment. They stayed silent, glowering at the cameras, refusing to admit even the existence of their organizations. But not Willie. When Willie Moretti was called to testify, he didn't just show up. He gave a performance. He joked with the senators. He smiled for the cameras. He invited the committee members to his home for dinner. While the public found him charming, his associates were watching the television screens with growing horror. Moretti was breaking the sacred code of omerta, not necessarily by snitching in the traditional sense, but by making the life look like a circus. He was bringing the wrong kind of heat, and his increasingly rambling, incoherent stories suggested that he was no longer in control of his faculties. To men like Vito Genovese, a man who valued cold efficiency and absolute secrecy, Moretti's condition was no longer a personal tragedy. It was a liability. Genovese was already plotting to take over the family from Frank Costello, and Moretti was Costello's most loyal and powerful ally. If Moretti was out of the way, Costello would be vulnerable. The Immerse killing is a term often used in mob lore to describe the execution of a friend who has become a danger to the collective. In the eyes of the Commission, the ruling body of the American Mafia, Willie Moretti had become a loose cannon. They feared that as his brain continued to deteriorate, he might accidentally reveal the inner workings of the syndicate, the locations of bodies, or the names of corrupt officials. The order was reportedly handed down with a heavy heart by some and cold calculation by others. The hit had to be handled by people Willie trusted, so he wouldn't see it coming. He wouldn't suffer the indignity of fear. On that October morning at Joe's Elbow Room, Willie walked in with four men. They were seen laughing as they entered the restaurant at around 11:15 a.m. They sat in a booth at the back, away from the windows. Moretti, ever the extrovert, was heard speaking in Italian, his voice animated and cheerful. The waitress served them coffee. She noted later that they seemed like old friends. At 11:27 a.m., she walked toward the kitchen to check on their orders. Suddenly, the quiet atmosphere of the restaurant was punctuated by a rhythmic series of cracks, pops that sounded more like firecrackers than a heavy-caliber handgun. 2 shots to the head, 2 shots to the chest. Willie Moretti slumped over the table, his life ending instantly. The 4 men didn't run. They didn't scramble. They walked out of the restaurant with a chilling calmness, stepping into a waiting car and vanishing into the New Jersey traffic before the first scream was heard inside the restaurant. The aftermath of the Moretti hit sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. It was a signal that the old guard was fading and a new, more ruthless era was beginning under Vito Genovese. Frank Costello, devastated by the loss of his friend and protector, realized his grip on power was slipping. The police investigation was, as many expected, a dead end. Despite the shooting happening in a public place during the day, witnesses suddenly developed a collective case of amnesia. No one saw the faces clearly. No one could remember the license plate of the getaway car. In the world of 1951 New Jersey, people knew that seeing too much could lead to a seat at the same table Moretti had occupied. Willie Moretti's funeral was one of the largest the state had ever seen. Thousands of people lined the streets to see the bronze casket of the man who had been a local Robin Hood to some and a ruthless racketeer to others. Among the floral arrangements were tributes from some of the biggest names in entertainment and politics, silent acknowledgments of the reach Willie once had. But behind the flowers and the solemn faces, the message was clear. The syndicate came before friendship. It came before loyalty. It even came before mercy. The murder of Willie Moretti remains one of the most famous mob hits in history because of its audacity and its irony. A man who spent his life fixing problems for others couldn't fix the one growing inside his own mind. In the end, his own friends decided that the only way to keep Willie silent was to ensure he never spoke again. As the decades passed, Joe's elbow room changed names and eventually disappeared. But the story of the talkative underboss who laughed with his executioners remains a haunting reminder of the price of a life. In the world of the mafia, the loudest voice is often the first one silenced. Next story, The Arsenic Alchemist. St. Neots, England, 1897. The Victorian era was a time of rigid propriety. Yet beneath the surface of stiff collars and tea services, it was an age defined by a peculiar obsession: poison. It was cheap, it was accessible, and for the disgruntled or the desperate, it was remarkably effective. But even in a century filled with black widows and beastly brothers, the case of Walter Horsford stands out. Not for its complexity, but for the chilling, clinical coldness of a man who thought he could simply erase a person with a postage stamp. Our story begins in the quiet, agrarian landscape of Huntingdonshire. St. Neots was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbor's business, and the local gossip moved faster than the mail. Annie Holmes was a 30-year-old widow living in a modest cottage in the village of Eynesbury. She was a mother of several children, struggling to make ends meet after the death of her husband, and she looked for support in the arms of her cousin, Walter Horsford. Walter was 25, a relatively well-to-do farmer from the nearby village of Spaldwick. He was described as a man of few words, hard-working, but perhaps possessed of a hidden arrogance. The relationship between the cousins was more than just familial. It was intimate. In an era where a widow's reputation was her only currency, their liaison was a closely guarded secret. But secrets have a way of manifesting in physical form. By late 1897, Annie realized she was pregnant. For Annie, this was a catastrophe. For Walter, who was busy courting a respectable woman he intended to marry, it was an inconvenience he could not afford. Annie began writing to Walter, her letters increasingly desperate, pleading for financial help or a solution. Walter's responses were initially evasive. He was a man of the earth, used to dealing with pests on the farm, and it seems he began to view Annie Holmes not as a human being he had once cared for, but as a blight that needed to be eradicated. On the evening of January 7th, 1898, a small package arrived for Annie Holmes. Inside were several packets of white powder and a note written in a cramped, deliberate hand. The instructions were simple. Take a little in warm water before going to bed. The note was signed with a pseudonym, but Annie knew who it was from. She believed Walter had finally sent her what she had asked for, a way to set things right. Likely a common, though dangerous, folk remedy to terminate the pregnancy. Annie followed the instructions precisely. She mixed the powder into a glass of water, drank it, and retired to her bed. Within minutes, the quiet of the Ainsbury cottage was shattered by screams that would haunt her children for the rest of their lives. Strychnine is a particularly cruel way to die. It does not put the body to sleep. It awakens every nerve to a state of agonizing hypersensitivity. It causes the muscles to contract so violently that the body arches into a rigid bow, a condition known as opisthotonos, where only the heels and the back of the head touch the bed. The victim remains fully conscious, feeling every bone-snapping spasm, unable to breathe as the respiratory muscles lock in a permanent state of inhalation. Annie's daughter, terrified, ran for the neighbors and the local doctor. They found Annie in the throes of these tetanic convulsions. In her final moments of lucidity, she gasped out the truth. She pointed to the glass, the packets, and the name of the man who had sent them. She died in agony less than an hour after taking the medicine. When the local police, led by Superintendent Arthur Sweeting, arrived at the cottage, they found the evidence exactly where Annie had indicated. There were several small paper packets, one of which was labeled 1 gram of strychnine. Poison. It was an almost staggering display of overconfidence. The killer hadn't even bothered to remove the label from the chemist. The investigation moved with a speed that was rare for the late 19th century. Sweeting traveled to Spaldwick to interview Walter Horsford. Walter was calm, almost detached. He admitted to knowing Annie, but denied sending any packages or having any intimate involvement with her. He claimed he hadn't seen her in months. However, the police began a meticulous search of the local chemists in the surrounding towns. It didn't take long to find a match. In the ledger of a chemist in St. Neots, they found an entry from a few weeks prior. Walter Horsford, 90 grains of strychnine for the purpose of killing rats. Under the laws of the time, chemists were required to record the sale of poisons in a poison book, and the buyer had to sign for it. Walter had signed his own name. He had used his real name to buy the very weapon that killed his cousin, and then mailed it to her in a package that could be traced directly back to his local post office. As the detectives dug deeper, they discovered that Walter Horsford wasn't just a murderer. He was a serial predator of his own relatives. They looked into the death of another cousin, Fanny Throssell, who had died under mysterious, similar circumstances sometime earlier after being involved with Walter. While they couldn't exhume every body in the churchyard, the pattern was becoming terrifyingly clear. Walter used poison the way other men used a breakup letter. The trial took place at the Huntingdon Assizes in June 1898. The prosecution's case was a mountain of physical evidence. They had the chemist's ledger, the testimony of the postman who remembered the package, and most damningly, the handwriting on the instructions sent to Annie. Handwriting analysis was an emerging science at the time, but the similarities between Walter's known writing and the take in warm water note were undeniable. The defense tried to argue that Annie had taken the poison herself in a fit of melancholia, but the sheer dosage found in her system, enough to kill 10 men, and the presence of the other unopened packets made the accident, or suicide theory, laughably improbable. Throughout the trial, Walter Horsford maintained a mask of cold indifference. He sat in the dock, frequently preening himself, adjusting his tie, and looking bored by the proceedings. He seemed to believe that his status as a respectable farmer would shield him from the gallows, regardless of the evidence. He underestimated the jury's reaction to the cruelty of his method. In the Victorian mind, there is nothing more cowardly than a man who uses a woman's trust to feed her agony. The jury took less than half an hour to return a verdict of guilty. When the judge donned the black cap to pronounce the sentence of death, Horsford showed the first crack in his armor. His face went pale, but he remained silent. While awaiting execution in Cambridge jail, Horsford's arrogance didn't wane. He wrote letters to his family claiming he was a martyr, a victim of a wicked conspiracy. He never expressed a single word of remorse for Annie Holmes or the children he had left motherless. On August 4th, 1898, the long walk to the scaffold began. The executioner was James Billington, a man known for his efficiency. As Horsford stood on the trapdoor, he was asked if he had any final words. He remained stony-faced and silent. The bolt was drawn, and the life of Walter Horsford ended. Annie Holmes sought help from someone she trusted. Walter Horsford gave her a death sentence instead. In the end, his own signature in a chemist's book was the only confession the world ever needed. Next story, the Bermondsey Horror. London, England, 1849. The fog in Victorian London was never just weather. It was pea soupers, thick, yellowish, and smelling of coal smoke and rotting river water. It was a shroud that clung to the cobblestones of Bermondsey, a district known for its tanneries and the overwhelming stench of cured hides. But in the late summer of 1849, a different kind of smell began to rise from the floorboards of a modest terrace house at 3 Minver Place. It was a scent that would lead police to a discovery so gruesome it would captivate the entire British Empire, involving a cold-blooded couple, a hidden pit of quicklime, and a chase that spanned across the Irish Sea. This is the story of Maria and Frederick Manning, the architects of what the press would forever dub the Bermondsey Horror. To understand the crime, you have to understand the players. Maria Manning, born Maria de Roux in Switzerland, was a woman of high ambitions and even higher cheekbones. She had served as a lady's maid to the aristocracy, moving through the gilded halls of the Duchess of Sutherland. She was polished, spoke multiple languages, and possessed a piercing, dark-eyed gaze that suggested she was never quite satisfied with her station in life. She wanted wealth, and she wasn't particularly patient about earning it. Then there was Frederick Manning. By all accounts, Frederick was the weaker link. A former guard on the Great Western Railway, he had been fired under a cloud of suspicion regarding a mail robbery. He was heavy-set, somewhat dull-witted, and utterly under the thumb of his wife. They were a volatile match, a woman with a predator's instinct and a man with just enough desperation to be dangerous. But there was a third person in this marriage, Patrick O'Connor. O'Connor was a gauger for the London Customs House, a man of considerable means who had a reputation for being a bit of a moneylender on the side. He was also a longtime admirer of Maria. In fact, Maria had been dating both Frederick and Patrick at the same time, eventually choosing Frederick because she mistakenly believed he was set to inherit a large fortune. When that inheritance turned out to be a fantasy, Maria didn't leave Frederick. She simply kept O'Connor on a leash. For years, Patrick O'Connor was a friend of the family, frequently dining at their home, perhaps hoping that Maria's affections might one day shift back to him. By 1849, the Mannings were in financial ruin. The friendship with O'Connor took on a predatory edge. Maria knew O'Connor kept a fortune in railway shares and cash at his lodgings. She knew his habits, and she knew that as long as Patrick O'Connor was alive, that money belonged to him. If he were to disappear, however, and his keys were to find their way into her hands, well, the problem of the Mannings' poverty would be solved overnight. On the morning of August 9th, 1849, Patrick O'Connor received a handwritten note from Maria. It was an invitation to dinner at Minver Place. He was seen by friends later that afternoon, dressed in his finest clothes, heading toward Bermondsey. He was even seen leaning over the wall of the Mannings' garden, chatting with Maria. It was the last time Patrick O'Connor was seen alive. When O'Connor failed to show up for work at the Customs House the next day, his colleagues weren't immediately panicked. But by the second day, and the third, his friends grew suspicious. They knew of his relationship with the Mannings and decided to pay the couple a visit. When they arrived at 3 Minver Place, they found the house eerily silent. Maria was there, but she was evasive, claiming O'Connor hadn't shown up for dinner at all. A few days later, the friends returned with the police. This time, the house was completely empty. The Mannings had vanished. The furniture had been hastily sold to a broker, and the couple was nowhere to be found. The police, led by Inspector Barnes, began a meticulous search of the property. The house was clean, too clean. But when they reached the kitchen, Barnes noticed something off. The kitchen floor was made of heavy flagstones. Most of them were covered in a layer of grime consistent with a London basement, but 2 or 3 stones looked as though the mortar between them was fresh. One of the officers took a crowbar and pried up a stone. As the stone came up, the smell hit them, a potent mix of damp earth and chemical lime. Beneath the stones, in a shallow grave filled with quicklime to accelerate decomposition, lay the body of Patrick O'Connor. He had been shot in the back of the head and then finished off with a heavy tool, his skull shattered. He was identified only by his dental work and his distinctive clothing. The betrayal was absolute. He had been buried directly under the spot where his friends had been eating their dinner for the past week. The hunt for the Mannings became a Victorian sensation. It was the trial of the century before the century was even halfway over. Maria, ever the strategist, had realized the walls were closing in and had fled first. She hadn't gone with her husband, though. She had robbed O'Connor's lodgings of his railway shares and cash, packed her trunks, and hopped a train to Edinburgh. Frederick, left to his own devices and likely terrified, had fled in a different direction, crossing the water to the island of Jersey. Maria's downfall was her own vanity and the very wealth she killed for. In Edinburgh, she tried to cash in the stolen railway shares. The brokers, alerted by the national headlines, grew suspicious of a lone woman trying to trade high-value certificates. They called the authorities. When the police arrived at her lodgings, they found her sitting calmly, surrounded by stolen goods. She didn't break. She didn't cry. She simply maintained a cold, aristocratic detachment. Frederick was caught shortly after on Jersey. Unlike his wife, he broke almost immediately. He began wailing that Maria had forced him into it, that she was the one who pulled the trigger, that he was merely a witness to her fury. The trial at the Old Bailey in October 1849 was a media circus. It was one of the first cases where the telegraph played a crucial role in the capture of suspects. The public was fascinated and repulsed by the Lady Macbeth of Bermondsey. Maria appeared in court dressed in black satin, a veil covering her face, looking more like a mourning widow than a woman accused of a calculated execution. The Mannings' defense was a spectacle of mutual betrayal. Frederick's lawyers argued he was a henpecked husband under the hypnotic spell of a wicked woman. Maria's lawyers argued that as a foreign national, she shouldn't even be tried under British law in this manner. Maria herself eventually snapped, screaming at the judge and jury, "You ought to be ashamed of yourselves. There is no justice for a foreign woman in this country." It took the jury less than an hour to find them both guilty. The execution took place on November 13th, 1849, atop the gatehouse of Horsemonger Lane Jail. In Victorian England, public hangings were a form of grim entertainment, and the Bermondsey horror drew a crowd estimated at 30,000 to 50,000 people. Among the spectators was a young Charles Dickens. Dickens was so horrified by the behavior of the crowd, the laughing, the drinking, the mocking of the dying, that he wrote a famous letter to the Times the next day, arguing that public executions served only to brutalize the populace. This letter is often cited as a turning point in the movement to move executions behind prison walls. As the couple stood on the scaffold, Frederick was a trembling wreck, needing to be supported by the executioner. Maria, however, remained defiant to the end. She wore a black satin dress, a choice that reportedly caused the sale of black satin to plummet in England for years because no respectable woman wanted to be associated with the Manning look. With a hood over her head and the noose tightened, Maria Manning and her husband were dropped into history. Next story, the Lake Bodom murders. Espoo, Finland, 1960. On the morning of June 5th, 1960, the shores of Lake Bodom were supposed to be a picture of mid-century serenity. The lake, located just west of Helsinki, was a popular getaway for locals looking to escape the city and enjoy the lush, quiet forests of Espoo. But as the sun began to rise over the water that Sunday, the silence was broken by a discovery so gruesome it would permanently alter the Finnish psyche. For teenagers, 2 boys and 2 girls had set out for a carefree weekend of camping. They were Mila Ermeli Björklund and Anya Talikimäki, both 15, and their boyfriends, Seppo Blauman and Nils Gustafsson, both 18. They were young, full of life, and looking forward to a night under the stars. They pitched their tent on a small peninsula, unaware that they were being watched from the shadows. The attack occurred in the pre-dawn hours, somewhere between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. It wasn't a standard assault. It was a scene out of a nightmare. The killer didn't even enter the tent. Instead, they attacked the teenagers through the canvas, using a knife and a heavy blunt instrument to slash and bludgeon them as they lay trapped and sleeping. The tent cords were cut, causing the heavy fabric to collapse on top of them, turning their sanctuary into a shroud. When the scene was finally discovered by a group of birdwatchers and later a swimmer, the sight was incomprehensible. 3 of the teenagers, Mila, Anya, and Seppo, were dead. They had suffered catastrophic injuries to their heads and necks. Mila, Nils's girlfriend, had been treated with the most significant brutality, found undressed from the waist down on top of the collapsed tent, having been struck and slashed far more than the others. But there was one survivor. Nils Gustafsson was found lying outside the tent, barely conscious. He had suffered a broken jaw, facial fractures, and a severe concussion. To the investigators who arrived on the scene, he appeared to be a lucky survivor of a random, monstrous attack. But the investigation that followed would become a masterclass in frustration and controversy. From the very beginning, the case was plagued by errors. The police failed to cordon off the area properly, allowing curious onlookers and even journalists to trample through the site, destroying potential footprints and forensic evidence. The murder weapons were never found. Puzzlingly, several items were missing from the campsite. The keys to the teenagers' motorcycles, their wallets, and even Nils's shoes. The shoes were eventually found hidden about half a kilometer away, but many of the other personal belongings vanished forever. For decades, the Lake Boda murders remained Finland's most haunting cold case. The mystery birthed 1,000 theories and several primary suspects that the public couldn't stop talking about. The first was Carl Valdemar Gillstrom, known locally as the Kiosk Man. He ran a nearby refreshment stand and was notorious for his deep hatred of campers. He had been known to cut tent ropes and throw rocks at people who got too close to his property. On his deathbed years later, he reportedly confessed to the murders, but at the time his wife provided an alibi that the police accepted. Only after her death did it emerge that she may have lied out of fear of her husband's violent temper. Then there was Hans Assmann, a German national living in the area who some suspected of being a KGB operative. On the morning after the murders, Assmann reportedly showed up at a Helsinki hospital with dirt under his fingernails and clothes stained with something red. He acted erratically, feigning unconsciousness, but the police never fully investigated him, citing a solid alibi that many still question today. Decades passed. The children who grew up hearing the story of Lake Bodom became adults, and the case faded into the realm of urban legend. That is, until 2004. 44 years after the crime, the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation made an announcement that shocked the world. They had arrested the lone survivor, Nils Gustafsson. Using modern DNA analysis, investigators re-examined the tent and the shoes found in the woods. They argued that the blood spatter patterns suggested Nils had been the one wearing the shoes during the attack. Their theory was a classic tale of a night gone wrong. A drunken argument, a fit of jealous rage directed at his girlfriend, and a brutal escalation that led to the deaths of his 3 friends. They claimed Nils had then inflicted injuries upon himself and hidden the evidence to play the part of the victim. The trial was a media firestorm. The prosecution pointed to his lack of memory and allegedly incriminating statements made during his arrest. However, the defense stood firm. They argued that the severity of Nils's injuries, specifically the broken jaw and the level of trauma, would have made it physically impossible for him to carry out such a high-energy, violent attack on 3 people, 2 of whom were athletic young men. In 2005, the court reached a verdict, citing a lack of concrete evidence and the impossibility of proving a motive after 4 decades. Nils Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges. The state was ordered to pay him tens of thousands of euros in compensation for the mental anguish of the trial. Today, Lake Bodom remains a place of quiet beauty, but the shadow of 1960 never truly lifted. The tent, preserved as a grim artifact of the crime, remains one of the most studied pieces of evidence in criminal history. The killer, whoever they were, took their secrets into the woods that morning and, despite the best efforts of modern science, has never been brought to justice. Next story, the murder of James Garfield. Washington, D.C., 1881. The summer of 1881 in Washington, D.C. was a stifling, humid affair, the kind of heat that seems to stick to the lungs. For the 20th President of the United States, James A. Garfield, it was supposed to be a day of transition, a departure from the swampy political infighting of the capital toward the cool, salt air breeze of the New Jersey shore. He was a man who had risen from a literal log cabin to the highest office in the land. A scholar-turned-soldier who had survived the carnage of the Civil War only to find himself trapped in the bureaucratic crossfire of a fractured Republican Party. On the morning of July 2nd, as his carriage rattled toward the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station, Garfield felt a rare sense of relief. He was heading to a college reunion at Williams College, looking forward to seeing his wife, Lucretia, who was recovering from malaria by the coast. He had no bodyguards. He had no Secret Service. In 1881, the American presidency was still an approachable, almost casual institution. But lurking in the shadows of the station's ladies' waiting room was a man who believed he had been sent by God to remove the president for the good of the nation. His name was Charles Guiteau, and in his pocket was a .44 caliber British Bulldog revolver with ivory grips, a detail he chose specifically because he thought it would look better in a museum one day. To understand why a man would wait in a humid train station to kill a president, you have to look into the fractured mind of Charles Guiteau. He was a man of spectacular failures. He had tried his hand at law, at theology, and even at communal living in the radical Oneida community, where he was so disliked that the members nicknamed him Charles Get Out. Guiteau was a narcissist who lived in a reality of his own making. When Garfield won the election, Guiteau convinced himself that he was the sole reason for the victory, having written a speech that he rarely delivered and that no one actually read. In his mind, the administration owed him a prestigious consulship in Paris. For months, Guiteau had stalked the halls of the State Department, cornering officials and even the president himself, demanding his reward. When he was finally, and quite bluntly, told by Secretary of State James G. Blaine to never return, something in Guiteau snapped. He didn't see his own incompetence. He saw a divine calling. He believed that the rift between the stalwart and half-breed factions of the Republican Party could only be healed if Garfield was out of the picture, making way for the vice president, Chester A. Arthur. To Guiteau, this wasn't murder. It was a removal. He spent his last few dollars on the revolver and began practicing his aim along the banks of the Potomac, the sound of his shots echoing across the water while the man he intended to kill worked just blocks away. At 9:30 a.m., President Garfield entered the station, walking arm in arm with Secretary Blaine. They were deep in conversation, relaxed and unguarded. Guiteau stepped out from the shadows, his heart racing not with fear, but with the adrenaline of a man who believed he was about to become a hero. He closed the distance to within a few feet, leveled the heavy revolver, and pulled the trigger. The first shot grazed the president's arm. Garfield spun around, crying out, "My God, what is this?" Before he could react further, a second shot rang out. This bullet struck Garfield in the back, just to the right of his spine, and he collapsed to the floor in a heap of wool and silk. The station erupted into chaos. Passengers screamed, and Blaine shouted for someone to stop the assassin. Guiteau didn't run far. He was almost immediately tackled by a police officer. As he was led away, he famously shouted, "I am a stalwart of the stalwarts. I did it, and I want to be arrested. Arthur is president now." While Guiteau was being hauled off to jail, the real tragedy was only just beginning on the floor of the train station. If James Garfield had been shot 20 years later, or perhaps even in a different country, he might have survived. The bullet had missed his spinal cord and his vital organs. It was lodged in his abdomen, tucked away in a place where, if left alone, it might have safely encapsulated in fat and muscle. But the medical science of 1881 was in a state of dangerous transition. The concept of germ theory, championed by Joseph Lister in Europe, was largely dismissed as voodoo by the elite American doctors of the day. Within minutes of the shooting, doctors began to arrive at the station. They didn't wash their hands. They didn't sterilize their instruments. In the middle of the crowded, dirty train station floor, physician after physician stuck their unwashed fingers into the president's open wound, probing for the bullet. They poked, they prodded, and they dug, turning a small, clean entry wound into a jagged, 3-inch deep cavern of mangled tissue. By the time they moved him back to the White House, they had introduced a cocktail of bacteria directly into his bloodstream. For the next 80 days, the United States watched in horror as their president slowly rotted from the inside out. The White House became a grim laboratory. Because the heat was unbearable, Navy engineers rigged up a primitive form of air conditioning, one of the first in history, using fans and crates of ice soaked in salt water to lower the temperature in the president's room. It worked, but it couldn't stop the infection that was ravaging his body. The lead physician, Dr. Willard Bliss, who, coincidentally, was named Doctor as his first name, took total control of the case. Bliss was a man of immense ego who refused to listen to any dissenting opinions. He insisted the bullet was on the right side of the body, despite evidence to the contrary. He even called in Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, who brought an early version of a metal detector to find a bullet. However, the device kept malfunctioning, emitting a frantic hum everywhere they moved it. What Bell didn't realize was that Garfield was lying on one of the few coil spring mattresses in existence at the time. The metal in the bed was interfering with the machine, and Dr. Bliss's insistence on only searching the right side of the body meant the bullet remained hidden. As July turned to August, Garfield's condition plummeted. He was a robust man of over 200 pounds when he was shot, but the infection caused his weight to wither away. He was plagued by agonizing abscesses. His body was riddled with pockets of pus, and his doctors continued their treatment by making more incisions and probing further with unwashed hands. They fed him a diet of bouillon and alcohol, which his body couldn't process. At one point, they were so desperate to get nutrients into him that they began rectal feeding, a process that was as agonizing as it sounds. Through it all, Garfield remained remarkably stoic, occasionally cracking jokes with his staff, though his eyes grew hollow and his skin took on a sallow, gray hue. By September, it was clear the end was near. Garfield asked to be taken to the sea, hoping the Atlantic breeze would provide some final comfort. A special train track was laid down overnight by hundreds of volunteers so that the president's carriage could be pulled directly to the door of a cottage in Elberon, New Jersey. On September 19, 1881, 80 days after the shooting, James Garfield finally succumbed. He didn't die from the bullet. He died from septicemia and a massive splenic artery aneurysm caused by the infection his doctors had introduced. While the nation mourned, the trial of Charles Guiteau became one of the first great media circuses in American history. Guiteau's defense was temporary insanity, though he preferred to call it divine pressure. He was a nightmare of a defendant. He sang in court, he insulted his own lawyers, and he gave long, rambling speeches to the gallery. He even tried to sue the government for $100,000, claiming his removal of the president had increased the value of the Republican Party. In a moment of unintended honesty, Guiteau famously told the court, "The doctors killed Garfield. I only shot him." It was a statement that history has largely validated. Nevertheless, the jury was unimpressed. They found him guilty in less than an hour. On June 30th, 1882, Guiteau was led to the gallows. Even then, he remained delusional to the end, dancing his way to the rope and reciting a poem he had written titled, "I Am Going to the Lordy." The legacy of the Garfield assassination is one of what-ifs. If he had lived, his scholarly approach to civil rights and his desire to overhaul the spoils system might have reshaped the late 19th century. Instead, his death served as the catalyst for the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, finally ending the era of political rewards that had driven Guteau to madness. But perhaps the most haunting part of the story lies in the medical autopsy. When they finally opened Garfield's body, they found the bullet. It wasn't on the right side, where Dr. Bliss had spent months digging. It was on the left, safely lodged in a layer of fat, harmlessly away from any vital structures. It was a bullet that should have caused a few weeks of bed rest, but instead, through the arrogance of man and the primitive state of science, it ended a presidency. Today, if you visit the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Maryland, you can see a section of James Garfield's spine, preserved in a jar, with the hole from the bullet still visible. A permanent monument to a man killed twice, once by a madman and once by the very people trying to save him. Next story, the Oklahoma Girl Scout murders. Mayes County, Oklahoma, 1977 in the early summer of 1977. The rolling hills of Mayes County, Oklahoma, were prepared to welcome hundreds of young girls to Camp Scott. Nestled deep in the woods near Locust Grove, the camp was a place of tradition, friendship, and the rugged beauty of the Ozark foothills. For three young girls, 10-year-old Doris Denise Groff, 9-year-old Michelle Guza, and 8-year-old Lori Lee Farmer, it was supposed to be a week of adventure. Instead, it became the setting for one of the most haunting mysteries in American history. The tragedy began to unfold during the very first night of the camp session, June 13th. A heavy thunderstorm moved through the area, the sound of rain drumming against the canvas of the tents. The girls were staying in the Kiowa unit, a cluster of tents furthest from the counselor's cabin. Because of the storm, the girls huddled together in their sleeping bags, seeking comfort in the darkness. The following morning, just before 6 a.m., a camp counselor making her rounds walked toward the showers. She passed a set of sleeping bags lying on the trail leading to the woods. At first glance, she thought they were bundles of equipment or perhaps a prank. Upon closer inspection, she made a discovery that would shatter the innocence of the region forever. The bodies of Lori, Michelle, and Denise had been left on the path, several yards away from their tent. The camp was immediately evacuated. As hundreds of panicked parents rushed to collect their children, a massive investigation was launched into the dense, muddy woods surrounding Camp Scott. What investigators found inside tent number 8 was chilling. The girls had been taken from their tent in the middle of the night, during the height of the storm, while their tent mates slept undisturbed just feet away. The brutality of the crime was matched only by the terrifying evidence that surfaced regarding the weeks leading up to the murders. During a training session 2 months prior, a counselor had returned to her tent to find it ransacked. Inside, her belongings had been rifled through, and a handwritten note had been left behind. It was a dark, prophetic message stating that 3 campers would be murdered. At the time, the note was dismissed as a tasteless prank. In the wake of the tragedy, it took on a much more sinister weight. The primary suspect soon emerged, Gene Leroy Hart. Hart was a local man who had grown up in the area and knew the surrounding woods intimately. He was a fugitive at the time, having escaped from a local jail where he was serving time for previous violent offenses. For 10 months, Hart evaded a massive manhunt, utilizing his knowledge of the caves and thickets of Mayes County to stay one step ahead of the law. The community was on edge. The idea of a predator living in the shadows of the woods, surviving off the land while mocking the authorities, created a cloud of fear that hung over the state. Finally, in April 1978, Hart was captured at a small cabin in Cookson Hills. The trial of Gene Leroy Hart was a media sensation. The prosecution presented physical evidence found near the scene and in a cave Hart was known to frequent, including items that allegedly belonged to the camp. However, the defense pointed to the lack of direct forensic links and the potential for evidence tampering. In a verdict that stunned the victims' families and much of the public, a local jury found Hart not guilty. The sense of closure was fleeting. While Hart was acquitted of the murders, he was returned to prison to serve the remainder of his previous sentences. Just months later, while exercising in a prison yard, He collapsed and died of a heart attack. He took whatever secrets he held to his grave. Decades passed, but the shadows over Camp Scott never truly lifted. The camp was closed immediately after the murders and never reopened, its structures left to be reclaimed by the forest. For the families of Denise, Michelle, and Lori, the lack of a definitive conviction meant the wounds remained open in 2017. The Mays County Sheriff's Office used modern technology to take another look at the case. They conducted new DNA testing on the decades-old evidence. While the results were not enough to provide a 100% legal certainty by modern standards, authorities stated that the DNA profiles obtained strongly pointed toward Hart, and no other suspects were identified by the biological material. For many, this provided the closest thing to an answer they would ever receive. The Oklahoma Girl Scout murders changed the way summer camps across America operated. The era of total seclusion and unlocked tents gave way to heightened security and rigorous safety protocols. The tragedy serves as a somber reminder of a lost age of innocence and the enduring pain of a mystery that, for 40 years, haunted the heart of Oklahoma. Next story, the Manhattan Savings Institution heist. New York City, 1878. The corner of Bleecker Street and Broadway was, in 1878, the very pulse of New York City's commercial heart. It was a landscape of iron-fronted buildings, gas lamps, and the rhythmic clatter of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestones. Amidst this bustle stood the Manhattan Savings Institution, a fortress of Gilded Age wealth that promised its depositors the ultimate security. Its walls were thick, its reputation was impeccable, and its vault was considered a marvel of modern engineering, a steel and iron beast that no common thief could hope to tame. But George Leonidas Leslie was no common thief. To his neighbors in the affluent districts of the city, he was a refined gentleman, an architect with a keen eye for aesthetics and a penchant for fine opera. To the criminal underworld, he was Western George, the most methodical criminal mastermind in American history. He didn't see a bank as a challenge of strength. He saw it as a blueprint waiting to be dismantled. On the morning of Sunday, October 27th, 1878, the city was draped in the quiet stillness of the Sabbath. Inside the bank, the atmosphere was supposed to be equally serene. Louis Werkel, the bank's janitor who lived on the premises with his family, was doing what he did every Sunday morning. But as he moved through the shadows of the silent lobby, the silence was shattered. Several masked men materialized from the darkness of the back offices. Before Werkel could cry out, he was tackled, gagged, and bound. His wife and mother-in-law were treated with the same cold efficiency. The invaders weren't there for violence, though. They were there for the steal. They moved with a terrifying level of familiarity. They didn't stumble. They didn't whisper in confusion. They knew exactly where the guards should have been, exactly which floorboards creaked, and exactly how many paces it took to reach the massive vault. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was the culmination of 3 years of obsessive planning. George Leslie's approach to a heist was more akin to a scientific experiment than a robbery. Years earlier, he had begun his research on the Manhattan Savings Institution. He didn't just watch the building, he studied it. He acquired the architectural plans for the bank. He rented a warehouse in Brooklyn where he built a full-scale wooden replica of the bank's vault. For months, he and his hand-picked crew practiced in total darkness, learning to navigate the space by touch alone, timing their movements to the second. Leslie's brilliance lay in his understanding of the human element. He knew that even the thickest steel had a weakness if the person holding the key could be compromised. He had spent years cultivating an inside man, Patrick Shevlin, a bank watchman. Through a mix of bribery and perhaps a bit of quiet intimidation, Shevlin provided Leslie with something far more valuable than a map. He provided the combination to the outer lock of the vault. As the sun began to crest over the Manhattan skyline on that Sunday morning, the crew stood before the great vault. Among them was banjo Pete Emerson and Abe Coakley, men who were legends in the shadows for their dexterity with tools. They didn't use explosives. Black powder was loud, messy, and unpredictable. Instead, They used the little joker. This was a tiny, ingenious device Leslie had designed, a thin wire tool that could be inserted into the dial of a combination lock to feel the drop of the tumblers. With the outer door open thanks to the combination provided by Shevlin, they faced the inner chest. The air in the vault room was thick with the smell of oil and sweat. The men worked with surgical precision. Using specialized drills and jacks, they slowly, quietly pried the inner plates of the safe. It was a mechanical ballet. While the city slept, the greatest fortune in New York was being bled dry. When the inner doors finally groaned open, the sight was enough to make even the most hardened criminal catch his breath. Stacked in neat, oppressive rows were bundles of greenbacks and gold certificates. There were piles of negotiable bonds and securities. The haul was staggering. They began stuffing the loot into heavy canvas bags. They didn't take everything. They were selective, focusing on the items that were hardest to trace but easiest to carry. By 6 a.m., the job was done. The masked men slipped out of the building as quietly as they had entered, disappearing into the morning mist of Broadway. They left behind a bound and terrified family and a bank vault that looked, from a distance, perfectly intact. It wasn't until the day watchman arrived later that morning that the scale of the disaster was realized. When the police finally forced their way into the inner vault, they found it hollowed out. The initial estimate of the loss was nearly $3 million, an astronomical sum in 1878, equivalent to over $80 million today. It was, at the time, the largest bank robbery in the history of the United States. The New York Police Department was humiliated. The Manhattan Savings Institution was supposed to be impregnable. The press had a field day, mocking the authorities and the bank directors who had boasted of their burglar-proof technology. The investigation was led by the legendary Inspector Thomas Burns, a man known for his third-degree interrogation tactics and his rogues gallery of known criminals. Burns knew immediately that this wasn't the work of street thugs. This had the signature of a professional. This had the signature of George Leslie. However, the investigation hit a wall of silence. The underworld knew that talking about Western George was a death sentence. Furthermore, Leslie had been careful. He had shielded himself behind layers of subordinates. But as the weeks turned into months, the pressure began to fracture the heist crew. The problem with a $3 million haul is that it is incredibly difficult to hide, and even harder to split. The loot consisted largely of registered bonds, securities that were recorded in the bank's ledgers and were difficult to cash without raising suspicion. The thieves had the paper, but they didn't have the wash. Greed, the eternal undoing of the great thief, began to set in. Internal tensions among the gang were simmering long before the heist even took place. George Leslie, despite his genius, was a man of many vices. He was a philanderer who had become entangled with the wives and mistresses of his own associates. Specifically, he had caught the eye of the wife of Sean Draper, a brutal underworld figure and a key member of Leslie's inner circle. In the criminal world of the 1870s, there was a code of conduct regarding business, but there was a much darker code regarding betrayal. Draper was a man of violence, not of blueprints. While Leslie was the brain, Draper was the muscle, and the muscle was beginning to feel disrespected. As the police closed in, the gang began to turn on each other. The inside man, Patrick Shevlin, was the first to crack. Under the intense pressure of Burns' interrogation, he confessed his role and named his accomplices. The dominoes began to fall. Banjo, Pete, and several others were rounded up. But the biggest name was missing. George Leslie never lived to see the inside of a courtroom for the Manhattan Savings heist. In June 1878, just months before the heist was actually executed by his crew, Leslie's body was found at Tramps Rock in Yonkers. He had been shot in the head. The man who had revolutionized the art of the bank robbery, the man who had spent 3 years meticulously planning the Manhattan Savings job, was murdered by his own associates. Some say it was because of his affair with Draper's wife. Others say it was because the crew realized they didn't need to share the $3 million with a man who was becoming too high profile. The irony was profound. The crew used Leslie's exact plans, his exact tools, and his exact timing to pull off the heist of the century, but they did it over his dead body. The aftermath of the heist was a spectacle of legal maneuvering and public outrage. Most of the stolen bonds were eventually recovered because they were too hot to sell, but hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash and negotiable securities simply vanished into the ether of the New York underworld. The bank survived, but its reputation was forever scarred. Inspector Burns used the case to justify his increasingly aggressive tactics, creating a dead line at Fulton Street. Any known criminal caught south of it toward the financial district would be arrested on sight. The heist changed the way banks were built, leading to the development of time locks and even more complex security measures, starting an arms race between locksmiths and thieves that continues to this day. George Leonidas Leslie remains a ghost in the annals of American crime. He was a man who lived between two worlds, the high society of architects and the dark corners of the Bowery. He proved that no vault was truly safe, and that the most dangerous part of any plan isn't the steel door or the armed guard. It's the people standing right next to you. Next story, the murder of Shanda Sharer. Madison, Indiana, 1992. On the night of January 11th, 1992, the air in Madison, Indiana, was biting. It was the kind of cold that forced people deep into their homes, seeking the warmth of wood stoves and television sets. But on a lonely, gravel hunting path just over the border in Kentucky, the darkness was interrupted by the flicker of headlights and a plume of smoke that refused to dissipate. A group of hunters, out earlier than most, stumbled upon a sight that would forever strip the town of its Midwestern innocence. What they found was so horrific that seasoned investigators would later describe it as one of the most haunting scenes of their entire careers. At the center of it was a 12-year-old girl named Shanda Sharer. To understand how Shanda ended up on that desolate road, we have to look back at the weeks leading up to that night. Shanda was a bright, energetic girl with a wide smile and a love for softball. She had recently moved to Madison to live with her father, seeking a fresh start in a new middle school. Like many girls her age, Shanda was navigating the often treacherous waters of teenage social circles. She was looking for friendship, for a place to belong. But in the winter of 1991, she inadvertently stepped into a web of jealousy and toxic obsession that was far beyond her comprehension. The catalyst for this tragedy was a 14-year-old girl named Amanda. Amanda was known for having a magnetic, albeit volatile, personality. She was dating an older girl named Melinda, who was 18. Melinda was intense, deeply protective of her relationships, and possessed a temper that often teetered on the edge of violence. When Shanda began spending time with Amanda, a rivalry began to simmer. It started with petty schoolyard notes and phone calls, the kind of drama that adults often dismiss as girls being girls. But in the minds of these teenagers, it was a war. Melinda felt threatened by Shanda. She viewed the 12-year-old not as a child, but as a romantic competitor. This delusion was fueled by two other friends, Lori and Hope. Lori, 18, was Melinda's close confidant, and Hope, 15, was a follower who seemed desperate for approval. Together, these four individuals began to cultivate a shared hatred for Shanda. They didn't just want her to leave Amanda alone. They wanted to punish her. The plan began to take shape on the evening of January 10th. The group gathered, fueled by a mixture of teenage angst and a terrifyingly cold sense of purpose. They drove to Shanda's house, parked down the street, and waited. One of them lured Shanda out of her home under the guise of a peace offering, a chance to talk things through and finally end the feud. Shanda, being optimistic and perhaps a bit naive, believed them. She slipped out of her bedroom window, wearing only a light jacket, and climbed into the back seat of their car. She thought she was going to a hangout. Instead, she had just walked into a nightmare. As soon as the car doors locked, the atmosphere shifted. The light-hearted facade vanished, replaced by a cold, predatory silence. They drove Shanda away from the safety of her neighborhood and toward an isolated area near a local cemetery. It was here that the psychological torment began. They accused her of trying to steal Amanda away, their voices rising in a crescendo of anger. Shanda, terrified and realizing the danger she was in, tried to apologize, to plead, to explain that it was all a misunderstanding. Her words fell on deaf ears. The group didn't just want to scare her. They wanted to exert total control. They forced Shanda out of the car and into the trunk. The metallic thud of the lid closing was the last sound of the world Shanda knew. From that point on, she was no longer a person to them. She was a target. They drove for hours, crossing the state line into Kentucky. Inside the trunk, Shanda was subjected to the terrifying sensation of every turn and every bump in the road, never knowing where she was going or what was waiting for her when the car finally stopped. The group inside the cabin, meanwhile, was reportedly calm, even casual, discussing their plan as if they were deciding on a place to eat dinner. When they finally pulled over at a remote hunting ground near Milton, Kentucky, the cruelty reached a point of no return. They dragged Shanda from the trunk. The physical assault that followed was relentless and systematic. They used various objects found in the car and the surrounding woods to inflict pain. Shanda begged for her life, promising she would move away, promising she would never speak to any of them again. She even asked if they could just kill her quickly. Such was the level of her suffering. But they weren't finished. In a display of chilling detachment, the group eventually left Shanda lying in the dirt, believing she was dead or close to it. They drove back toward Madison, stopping at a convenience store to buy sodas and snacks. They laughed. They acted as if nothing had happened. However, as they sat in the car, they began to worry. What if she survived? What if she crawled to a road and told someone? The decision was made to go back. When they returned to the site, they found that Shanda had indeed moved. In a desperate attempt to save herself, she had tried to crawl toward the light of a distant farmhouse. This display of resilience didn't move her attackers to mercy. It only enraged them. They found her, and this time, they ensured she wouldn't be able to tell anyone anything. They doused the young girl in gasoline and set her ablaze while she was still conscious. The image of that fire against the dark Kentucky woods is something that has haunted the region for decades. It was an act of such profound depravity that it defied any conventional understanding of juvenile delinquency. The aftermath of the discovery was swift. Because the attackers had been so vocal about their hatred for Shanda in the days leading up to the murder, the police had a list of suspects almost immediately. Within 48 hours, Melinda, Lori, Hope, and Tony, a fifth associate who had been present for parts of the night, were in custody. The trial that followed was a media sensation, though for all the wrong reasons. The public struggled to reconcile the ages and genders of the defendants with the sheer brutality of the crime. In the early 90s, the prevailing narrative of violent crime usually involved adult men. The idea of 4 teenage girls committing a premeditated torture slaying was unthinkable. The courtroom became a stage for finger-pointing. Each girl tried to minimize her role, claiming they were pressured by the others or that they didn't realize things would go that far. But the evidence was overwhelming. The forensic details of Shanda's final hours were so gruesome that several jurors had to be excused. The prosecution painted a picture of a pack mentality, where the group's collective desire for vengeance overrode any individual sense of morality. Melinda, viewed as the ringleader, received the harshest sentence, life without the possibility of parole. Lori and Hope also received life sentences, while Tony, who cooperated with the state, received a shorter term. Over the years, the legal battles continued. Because of their ages at the time of the crime, several of the sentences were eventually commuted or modified following changes in state and federal laws regarding juvenile life sentences. Today, most of the women involved have been released from prison. This fact remains a point of deep pain and controversy for the Scherer family and the community of Madison. For them, there is no moving on from a crime that was so deliberately cruel. The legacy of Shanda Scherer is one of immense tragedy, but also one of cautionary awareness. Her mother, Jackie, became a tireless advocate for victims' rights and an educator on the dangers of teen bullying and mean girl culture taken to its most lethal extreme. She refused to let Shanda be remembered only as a victim on a gravel road. She wanted her daughter's name to stand for the protection of other children. As the sun rose over that Kentucky hunting ground on January 11th, the smoke cleared, but the shadow stayed. It's a shadow that reminds us of a 12-year-old girl who fought until her very last breath, in a town that will never forget her name. Next story, the murder of Janet Marshall. Pas-de-Calais, France, 1955. The winds whipping off the English Channel in the summer of 1955 were supposed to be a reprieve for Janet Marshall. At 29 years old, Janet was a woman who embodied the quiet, disciplined independence of post-war Britain. A schoolteacher from Nottingham, she was known for her steady nerves and her passion for the outdoors. She wasn't one for luxury resorts or crowded tourist traps. Instead, she preferred the solitude of the open road and the rhythmic spin of bicycle tires on pavement. Janet had planned a solo cycling holiday across France, a feat that required both physical stamina and a certain level of courage for a woman traveling alone in a foreign country just a decade after the end of the Second World War. She arrived in the port of Boulogne in late August, her bicycle loaded with essential gear, her maps meticulously marked. Her goal was simple: to take in the rustic beauty of the French countryside, moving from village to village at her own pace. For the first few days, the trip was exactly what she had envisioned. She sent postcards home to her parents, describing the golden fields and the hospitality of the locals. On August 28th, she was seen cycling through the small, quiet village of Bellowy-sur-Somme. She looked every bit the adventurous traveler, sun-kissed, focused, and seemingly without a care in the world. But as the sun began to dip toward the horizon that evening, Janet Marshall vanished from the sight of the world. When Janet failed to return to Nottingham as scheduled, her parents' initial flickers of worry ignited into a full-blown panic. Janet was punctual, a creature of habit who would never simply forget to call or miss a return ferry. By the time the British authorities contacted their French counterparts, Janet had been missing for over a week. On September 3rd, the search came to a devastating end. In a dense, overgrown thicket known as the Wood of La Mer, near the village of Roux, a local man stumbled upon a site that would haunt the region for decades. Tucked away from the main road, partially hidden by the brambles, was the body of Janet Marshall. The scene was harrowing. Janet had been brutally beaten. Her skull was fractured, and there were clear signs of manual strangulation. Her bicycle was found nearby, cast aside like trash. Most chillingly, despite the violence of the struggle, her belongings didn't seem to be the primary motive. While some of her money was missing, her jewelry and other personal items were left behind. This wasn't a simple robbery gone wrong. This was an act of predatory aggression. The discovery sent shockwaves through both France and Britain. In the mid-50s, the Grand Tour style of holiday was becoming popular again, and the idea that a young woman could be hunted down and murdered while cycling through the peaceful French countryside was a terrifying blow to the public's sense of security. The French Sûreté Nationale took charge of the investigation, led by Commissaire Divisionnaire Chabot, a man known for his meticulous, if somewhat old-school, approach to detective work. The pressure was immense. The British press was breathing down their necks, demanding justice for the English Rose killed on French soil. The investigation began with the who. Who would have been in those woods? Who would have targeted a lone cyclist? The police flooded the area around Roux and Bellowy-sur-Somme, questioning hundreds of villagers. They were looking for a monstre, a man with a history of violence, or someone who had been seen acting erratically. Witnesses slowly began to emerge. A few locals recalled seeing a man on a bicycle following Janet in the hours before she disappeared. They described him as rough-looking, perhaps a laborer, wearing a distinctive cap. Others mentioned a man seen emerging from the wood of La Mer on the night of the murder, looking disheveled and hurried. The police narrowed their focus on a local man named Robert Avril. Avril was a 32-year-old itinerant laborer with a checkered past. He was a loner, often seen wandering the roads on his own bicycle, and he had a reputation for being hot-tempered. More importantly, he fit the physical description provided by several witnesses. When a Sûreté picked up Avril for questioning, they found him to be a difficult subject. He was evasive, his alibis were thin, and he seemed to have a deep-seated resentment toward authority. However, in 1955, forensic science was in its infancy. There was no DNA testing, and fingerprinting at a rural crime scene in the woods was notoriously difficult. The case relied on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. Chabot's team worked tirelessly to build a timeline. Next story, the University of Texas Tower shooting. Austin, Texas, 1966. The morning of August 1st, 1966 in Austin, Texas, began with the kind of oppressive, heavy heat that only a Gulf Coast summer can produce. By 11:30 a.m., the temperature was already climbing toward the triple digits, and the air felt thick enough to touch. On the campus of the University of Texas, the atmosphere was typical for a Monday in the summer session. Students were rushing between buildings with stacks of books tucked under their arms, and tourists were wandering near the main building, admiring the Spanish Renaissance architecture of the tower that loomed 307 feet over the city. The tower was the pride of the university, a limestone needle topped with a gold leaf clock face. It was a symbol of higher learning, visible from almost anywhere in Austin. But as the clock hands moved toward noon, that symbol was about to be transformed into a fortress for a nightmare that would forever change the American psyche. Earlier that morning, a 25-year-old architectural engineering student and former Marine named Charles climbed into a small car. He was a man known for his Eagle Scout background, his polite demeanor, and his military service. To those who knew him, he was the picture of an all-American success story. But inside his mind, a storm had been brewing for months. He had been visiting doctors, complaining of overwhelming headaches and unusual and irrational thoughts. He felt a growing, dark impulse that he couldn't name and couldn't stop. Before he left for the campus, the darkness had already claimed its first victims. In the early morning hours, Charles had ended the lives of his mother and his wife. He left behind a note, typed with chilling precision, explaining that he loved them both dearly, but wanted to spare them the embarrassment of what he was about to do. He wrote about a tremendous amount of hostility and a desire for an autopsy to be performed on his brain after his death to see if there was a physical cause for his actions. By the time he reached the university, Charles was heavily armed. He carried a footlocker filled with a staggering arsenal, a bolt-action deer rifle with a 4X scope, a 12-gauge shotgun, a .35 caliber pump rifle, several pistols, and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. He also packed supplies for a long siege, water, gasoline, food, and a radio. He dressed in a pair of overalls to look like a maintenance worker, allowing him to bypass security and haul his heavy trunk toward the elevators of the tower. At approximately 11:45 a.m., he reached the 27th floor. He encountered a receptionist, Edna Townsley, a longtime university employee. Without a word, he struck her, inflicting fatal injuries. As he made his way toward the observation deck, he encountered a small group of visitors, two families who had been sightseeing. He fired his shotgun down the narrow hallway, claiming more lives before they could even understand they were in danger. Charles then stepped out onto the narrow, wrap-around observation deck. From this vantage point, he had a 360-degree view of the entire 40-acre campus and the surrounding city. He was shielded by thick limestone walls with narrow drainage ports that acted like the battlements of a medieval castle. He was invisible to the people below, but everyone below was perfectly visible to him. The first shot rang out at 11:48 a.m. At first, the sound was dismissed. Some thought it was the backfire of a truck. Others thought it was noise from a nearby construction site. But then, a young woman who was 8 months pregnant collapsed on the concrete plaza. Her boyfriend, Claire Wilson, knelt to help her and was immediately struck himself. Across the mall, people began to drop. The sharp, rhythmic crack of a high-powered rifle echoed off the surrounding buildings, followed by the terrifying realization that the backfire was actually gunfire coming from the sky. For the next 96 minutes, the University of Texas became a kill zone. The shooter was a marksman. From his perch over 200 feet in the air, he was hitting targets that were moving, targets that were hundreds of yards away, and targets that thought they were hidden behind thin cover. He showed no bias in his selection. He fired at students, faculty, delivery drivers, and even people blocks away on Guadalupe Street, known locally as the Drag. History books often describe the scene as one of pure chaos, but there was also a surreal, frozen quality to it. Because this was 1966, the concept of a mass shooter didn't exist in the public consciousness. There were no active shooter protocols. There were no SWAT teams. The police officers who arrived on the scene were equipped with standard issue .38 caliber revolvers and some shotguns, completely outmatched by the long-range precision of the rifle in the tower. As the body count rose, the people of Austin did something that seems unthinkable today. Realizing the police were outgunned, local citizens went home, grabbed their own hunting rifles, and returned to the campus. They took up positions behind trees, cars, and stone pillars, and began returning fire at the tower. While this did not stop the shooter, it created a crucial tactical advantage. The sheer volume of lead hitting the limestone walls of the observation deck forced the shooter to stay low. He had to fire through the narrow scuppers or drainage holes at the base of the wall, which limited his field of vision and slowed his rate of fire. This civilian barrage likely saved dozens of lives by pinning him down and preventing him from taking careful, aimed shots at the people trapped in the open spaces of the plaza. Despite the return fire, the shooter remained a deadly threat. He managed to hit a police officer, Billy Speed, through a narrow gap between stone balusters. He struck a man who had simply stepped out of a clothing store to see what the noise was. The heat on the plaza was unbearable, and many of the wounded lay on the scorching pavement for nearly an hour, as anyone who tried to rescue them was immediately targeted. Inside the tower, the situation was becoming a desperate scramble. A few brave individuals decided that the only way to end the massacre was to go up. Police officer Ray Martinez, who had been off duty when the shooting started, arrived at the scene and immediately made his way to the tower. He was joined by Officer Houston McCoy and another officer, Jerry Day. Along the way, they were assisted by a civilian, Alan Crum, a 40-year-old retired Air Force tail gunner and manager of the university bookshop. Crum had been outside, trying to direct people away from the gunfire when he decided he couldn't just stand by. The four men entered the tower and began the slow, nerve-wracking ascent. They didn't know how many shooters were at the top, or if the stairs were booby-trapped. When they reached the 27th floor, they found the gruesome scene near the elevators. They continued upward to the small door that led to the observation deck. The heat inside the stairwell was stifling. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and limestone dust. Martinez and McCoy reached the top first. They stepped out onto the deck, moving cautiously around the corners of the square tower. Charles was crouched in the northwest corner, his attention focused on the people on the ground below. He was waiting for his next target. Officer Martinez rounded the corner and opened fire with his revolver, followed closely by Officer McCoy, who was armed with a shotgun. The confrontation was instantaneous and final. The 96-minute reign of terror was over. When the dust settled, the numbers were staggering. Including the shooter's mother and wife, 17 people were dead. More than 30 others were wounded, many with life-altering injuries. It was at that point the deadliest mass shooting in American history, a record that would sadly hold for decades. In the aftermath, the city and the nation struggled to find an answer to the most haunting question: why? Charles's body was taken for the autopsy he had requested in his final note. The medical examiner found a small tumor, a glioblastoma, about the size of a pecan, pressing against his amygdala, the part of the brain that regulates emotion and impulse control. For years, experts have debated whether this tumor was the catalyst for his descent into violence, or if the roots of his actions were purely psychological, tied to a difficult relationship with his father and the pressures of his life. The University of Texas Tower shooting was a loss of innocence for the country. It was the moment the public square ceased to feel inherently safe. It led directly to the creation of SWAT teams in police departments across the United States, as law enforcement realized they needed specialized training and equipment to handle high-ground snipers and barricaded suspects. The tower itself was closed to the public for many years. The bullet holes in the limestone were patched, and the blood was washed from the plaza, but the scars on the community remained. For decades, the university chose not to talk about it. hoping that silence would help the memory fade. It wasn't until 1999 that a formal memorial garden was dedicated to the victims, and not until the 50th anniversary in 2016 that a monument was placed near the tower, finally naming those who lost their lives on that sweltering August day. Today, the tower still stands as the centerpiece of the Austin skyline. Students still sit on the plaza, drinking coffee and studying for exams. But if you look closely at the stone walls of the surrounding buildings, you can still find the occasional chip in the masonry, a permanent reminder of the day the sky began to fire and the world was never quite the same again. Next story, the Diane Downs case. Springfield, Oregon, 1983. The night of May 19th, 1983, began like any other in the quiet suburban streets of Springfield, Oregon. But it would end in a scene of unimaginable horror, forever scarring a family and captivating a nation. Diane Downs, a 27-year-old mother of three, drove her children, Cheryl, 7, Danny, 3, and Christy, 8, home from a friend's house. What happened next, according to Diane, was a nightmare from which she barely escaped. She pulled her blood-splattered, bullet-riddled orange Datsun B210 into the emergency room parking lot of McKenzie Willamette Hospital. Her clothes were soaked, her voice hysterical. "Someone shot my children. They shot my children!" she screamed, rushing into the ER, her 3 young kids bleeding profusely in the back seat. The scene was chaotic. Cheryl, the youngest, was already gone. Danny was barely clinging to life, a bullet lodged in his spinal cord, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Christy, the oldest, had a bullet in her brain, her small body convulsing, her future hanging precariously in the balance. Diane herself had sustained a gunshot wound to her forearm, a seemingly superficial injury compared to the devastation inflicted upon her children. Police were immediately called. Detectives Doug Welch and Fred Hughey arrived to a scene of profound tragedy and baffling questions. Diane, still distraught, recounted a story of a large, shaggy-haired man who had flagged her down on a deserted rural road. She claimed he tried to steal her car, and when she resisted, he opened fire, shooting her and her children before fleeing in the night. The initial shock and sympathy for Diane were immense. A young mother, a victim of a random, brutal act of violence. But as the investigation unfolded, cracks began to appear in her story, inconsistencies that gnawed at the experienced detectives. First, there was the crime scene itself. The Datsun was a mess of blood and shattered glass, but the exterior showed no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no signs of impact from another vehicle. And the rural road Diane claimed the attack occurred on, it was rarely deserted, even late at night. Local residents often drove that route. Yet, no one reported hearing gunshots, seeing a suspicious vehicle, or anything out of the ordinary. Then there was Diane's demeanor. While initially hysterical, her grief seemed to dissipate remarkably quickly. Within days, she was giving interviews, appearing on television, seemingly relishing the spotlight. She even posed for glamour shots, smiling, something that struck many as profoundly unsettling for a woman who had just lost one child and had 2 others fighting for their lives. Detectives also found her account of the assailant vague and ever-changing. The shaggy-haired man became less defined with each retelling. Her wound, too, raised eyebrows. A clean, entry and exit wound on her forearm, almost too neat, suggesting it might have been self-inflicted, a way to make her story more believable. But the most damning evidence would come from the survivors. Danny, due to his injuries, couldn't communicate. But Christy, against all odds, began to recover. After weeks in a coma, she slowly regained consciousness. Her memory, however, was fractured, pieced together in fragments. The detectives knew Christy was the key. They waited patiently, carefully, for her to be strong enough to speak, to remember. Meanwhile, they delved deeper into Diane's life. What they found painted a disturbing picture. Diane Downs was a woman driven by a fierce desire for love and attention. She had a tumultuous relationship history, a penchant for drama, and a recent obsession with a married man named Robert Knickerbocker. Knickerbocker, a former co-worker, had expressed concern about Diane's children. He had told her he didn't want kids in his life, a fact that would later become chillingly significant. Detectives interviewed Knickerbocker, who confirmed his relationship with Diane but vehemently denied any involvement in the shooting. He was shaken, disturbed by Diane's intensity and her increasingly erratic behavior. Weeks turned into months. Christie's recovery progressed. Slowly, painfully, she began to recount the night of the shooting. The detectives worked with her gently, using dolls and drawings to help her express what she couldn't articulate in words. And then the words came. Words that shattered Diane's carefully constructed facade. My mom shot us. The confession from a child, the sole eyewitness, was devastating. Christie described how her mother had pulled over, taken a gun from under the seat, and systematically shot her and her siblings. She recounted how Diane had then shot herself in the arm, a staged injury to support her narrative. The motive, as the prosecution would later argue, was chillingly simple. Robert Knickerbocker didn't want children. Diane, desperate to win him back, saw her children as obstacles, impediments to her happiness. She believed if they were gone, Knickerbocker would return to her. Armed with Christie's testimony and the mounting inconsistencies in Diane's story, the police finally had enough to arrest her. On February 28, 1984, 9 months after the shooting, Diane Downs was taken into custody. The trial that followed was a media sensation. The image of the all-American mother, transformed into a cold-blooded killer, gripped the nation. Diane, ever the performer, maintained her innocence, even after her own daughter took the stand and testified against her. Christie's courageous testimony, delivered with remarkable clarity and detail for a child who had endured such trauma, was the turning point. The prosecution presented a powerful case, meticulously dissecting Diane's shifting narratives, her strange behavior, and the physical evidence that contradicted her story. The gun, a .22 caliber revolver, was never found, but the bullets recovered from the children were consistent with that type of weapon. The wound on Diane's arm, forensically examined, was determined to be self-inflicted. The defense, led by attorney James Jagger, tried to discredit Christie's testimony, suggesting it was influenced by the police and her traumatic brain injury. They also attempted to resurrect the story of the shaggy-haired man, but it was a narrative that had long lost its credibility that on June 17, 1984, after an emotional and grueling trial, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty on all counts. Diane Downs was convicted of 1 count of murder for Cheryl and 2 counts of attempted murder for Danny and Christy, and assault. The judge, James M. Maine, sentenced her to life in prison plus 50 years. He famously told her, "You are a woman who is extremely dangerous, a danger to any children that you may come in contact with." But the story of Diane Downs didn't end there. In 1987, she escaped from the Oregon Women's Correctional Center, a dramatic breakout that ignited another nationwide manhunt. She was apprehended 10 days later, hiding in a home just miles from the prison. Her escape only solidified her image as a manipulative and dangerous individual. Cheryl was laid to rest, a victim of her mother's desperate obsession. Danny, paralyzed for life, was adopted by his prosecutor, Fred Hughey, and his wife, resiliently facing his challenges. Christy, also adopted by the Hugheys, went on to live a remarkably normal life, testifying against her mother again during a parole hearing years later, ensuring she remained behind bars. Next story, the Bobby Curly thallium poisoning. Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, 1991. In the early 1990s, Wilkes-Barre was a town defined by its grit and its history of hard work. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, and the local university, Wilkes University, was a point of pride for the community. Among the many staff members at the school was 32-year-old Bobby Curly. Bobby was a man who seemed to have finally found his rhythm in life. He was a talented electrician, a newlywed, and by all accounts, a man who didn't have an enemy in the world. But in the late summer of 1991, Bobby began to suffer from a series of mysterious, agonizing symptoms that would baffle doctors and eventually uncover a plot so calculated and cold-blooded that it would change the way investigators looked at domestic homicides. It started with a strange tingling in his feet. At first, Bobby dismissed it as the byproduct of a long day on the job, crawling through cramped spaces and hauling heavy equipment. But the tingling quickly turned into a searing, burning pain that felt like he was walking on hot coals. Within days, the pain migrated up his legs. He became nauseated, his hair began to fall out in clumps, and his skin took on a sickly, translucent hue. Bobby was a strong man, but this unknown ailment was stripping him of his vitality with terrifying speed. When he was finally admitted to the hospital, his condition was a medical enigma. The doctors ran a battery of tests, looking for everything from Guillain-Barré syndrome to rare autoimmune disorders. Nothing fit. While Bobby lay in his hospital bed, his wife, Joanne, was a constant presence. She was the picture of the grieving, worried spouse, sitting by his side, stroking his hand, and tearfully asking the doctor for answers. Friends and family watched as she navigated the tragedy with a quiet strength, seemingly desperate to save the man she had married only a year prior. As Bobby's neurological system began to shut down, the doctors made a desperate, last-ditch effort to identify the cause. They sent samples of his blood and hair to a specialized lab. The results that came back sent a shockwave through the medical team. Bobby Curley wasn't sick with a disease. He was being poisoned. The substance found in his system was thallium. Thallium is often referred to as the poisoner's poison. It is tasteless, odorless, and colorless. Historically used as a rodenticide, it had been banned in the United States for decades because of its high toxicity to humans. It mimics potassium in the body, allowing it to slip past the blood-brain barrier and wreak havoc on the central nervous system. It is a slow, agonizing way to die, as the body essentially short-circuits from the inside out. The discovery shifted the case from medical emergency to a criminal investigation. But as Bobby's life hung in the balance, a second, even more disturbing discovery was made. Testing revealed that Bobby wasn't just exposed to a single, massive dose. The levels of thallium in his hair suggested he had been receiving small, consistent doses over a period of weeks, if not months. This wasn't an accident. Someone was feeding him poison day after day while watching him suffer. On September 23, 1991, Bobby Curley's heart finally gave out. He died in a hospital bed, surrounded by the very people who should have been his protectors. The local police, joined by the Pennsylvania State Police, began the grim task of retracing Bobby's final months. They looked at his workplace first. As an electrician at a university, perhaps he had stumbled upon old chemicals in a basement or a lab. The investigation into Wilkes University was exhaustive. Detectives checked every storage locker, every chemistry lab, and every maintenance closet. They found that while the university did have some old chemicals, there was no thallium missing, and more importantly, no one else at the school was sick. If the poisoning had happened at work, why was Bobby the only victim? They then turned their attention to the home. The dynamic between Bobby and Joanne was scrutinized. On the surface, they were the perfect couple. Joanne was a vibrant woman who worked as a nurse's aide, and Bobby was the hard-working provider. But as detectives dug deeper, the perfect image began to crack. They learned about tension over money and whispers of infidelity. Even more suspicious was the timing. Bobby's symptoms had worsened significantly after eating meals at home. However, the case hit a massive roadblock. There was no physical evidence linking Joanne to the poison. No bottles of thallium were found in the trash, and no paper trail showed her purchasing the substance. In fact, thallium was nearly impossible to obtain legally. The investigation stalled, and for years, Bobby's death remained an unsolved mystery. Joanne moved on, eventually collecting a significant life insurance payout and settling into a new life. But the investigators refused to let the case go cold. They were haunted by the cruelty of the crime, the idea of someone watching their spouse wither away while continuing to administer the poison. In 1994, a new team of investigators took over, headed by a persistent detective who believed the key lay in the hair samples. They used a technique called single-strand hair analysis. Because hair grows at a predictable rate, it acts as a timeline. By analyzing the thallium concentration in millimetric increments along a single strand of Bobby's hair, they could pinpoint exactly when he was poisoned. The results were a revelation. The spikes in thallium levels didn't just happen at random. They coincided perfectly with weekends and holidays, times when Bobby was home from work. Even more damning, there was a massive spike in the days leading up to his final hospitalization. This data effectively ruled out a workplace accident. The poison was being administered at home, in his food or drink. As the police intensified their pressure on Joanne's inner circle, the facade finally began to crumble. They turned their focus to Joanne's sister and a close family friend named Jack Burgess. Under intense interrogation, the truth began to leak out. It wasn't just Joanne. This was a conspiracy. The motive was as old as time: money and a desire for a different life. Joanne had become unhappy in the marriage almost immediately. Rather than seeking a divorce, she looked for a way out that would leave her financially secure. She had researched poisons and settled on thallium because she believed it would be undetectable. She had recruited her sister and Burgess to help her source the chemical and to provide her with moral support as she carried out the slow execution of her husband. Burgess eventually cracked, providing the most chilling detail of all. He described how Joanne would stir the thallium into Bobby's iced tea and his favorite soup. She would sit across the table from him, watching him struggle to hold his spoon with shaking hands, and then she would offer him another glass of the medicine that was actually killing him. The cruelty was breathtaking. Even when Bobby was in hospital, fighting for his life, Joanne was reportedly bringing him poisoned drinks to finish the job because she was terrified he might recover and realize what she had done. In 1996, 5 years after Bobby's death, Joanne Curley was finally arrested. The evidence from the hair analysis, combined with the testimony of her co-conspirators, created an airtight case. Confronted with the possibility of the death penalty, Joanne did something that shocked the community once again. She confessed. In a cold, clinical statement, she admitted to the poisoning. She described the process with a lack of emotion that chilled the courtroom. She pleaded guilty to third-degree murder in exchange for a sentence of 10 to 20 years. The light sentence was a bitter pill for Bobby's family to swallow. They had watched him die in agony for weeks, only for his killer to receive a sentence that meant she would likely be free while still in her prime. The Bobby Curley case remains a landmark in forensic science. It was one of the first times that hair analysis was used so precisely to map out the administration of a toxin over time. It transformed a strand of hair into a witness that couldn't be intimidated or silenced. Joanne Curley served her time and was released from prison in 2016. She walked out of the correctional facility a free woman, having completed her maximum sentence. But for the people of Wilkes-Barre, and especially for Bobby's family, the name Bobby Curley remains a reminder of a terrifying truth. That sometimes the person sitting across the dinner table, the one who promised to love and cherish you in sickness and in health, is the very person waiting for you to take your last breath. Next story: the murder of June and Devaney. Blackburn, England, 1948. The night of May 14th, 1948, was unusually still in the industrial town of Blackburn, Lancashire. In the post-war years, this was a community built on the rhythmic clatter of cotton mills and the quiet resilience of working-class families. Crime was present, certainly, but it was usually born of desperation or drunken brawls, not the kind of unthinkable malice that would soon descend upon Queen's Park Hospital. At Ward CH3, a pediatric ward housed in a somewhat isolated stone block of the hospital complex, the atmosphere was routine. 6 children lay sleeping under the watchful eye of the night staff. Among them was 3-year-old June and Devaney. June was recovering from a mild ailment, nearly ready to go home to her parents. She was a bright, happy child, described by nurses as a favorite in the ward. As the clock ticked past midnight, the night sister and a student nurse went about their rounds. At 1:20 a.m., a nurse checked on the children. All 6 were tucked in, breathing softly in the dim light. But when a nurse returned to the ward at 1:55 a.m., the silence was broken by a chilling void. June's cot was empty. At first, there was a frantic, logical search. Nurses checked the bathrooms, the corridors, and the other wards, thinking perhaps the child had woken up and wandered off in a state of confusion. But then they noticed the details. On the floor, near the foot of June's empty bed, sat a heavy glass water bottle. It was out of place. More unsettling were the marks on the polished floor, faint, oily smudges of bare footprints leading from the open veranda door to the cot and back again. The hospital was plunged into a nightmare. Within the hour, the police were summoned. As the first rays of dawn began to touch the hospital grounds, a search party moved through the shadows of the high stone walls. Just 300 yards from the ward, near the hospital's boundary wall, a searcher made a gruesome discovery. There, lying in the grass, was June and Devaney. She had been brutally sexually assaulted and murdered. The cause of death was horrific blunt force trauma. Her tiny body had been swung by the legs against the stone wall with such force that the impact had been fatal. The shock that rippled through Blackburn was instantaneous and visceral. This wasn't just a murder. It was a violation of the ultimate sanctuary, a hospital ward. The perpetrator had bypassed locked doors, moved through a darkened room filled with sleeping children, and snatched a toddler from her bed without waking a single soul. Chief Inspector John Capstick of Scotland Yard was called in to lead the investigation. Capstick, a legendary figure in British policing often referred to as Artful Charlie, knew he was facing a predator who was as bold as he was depraved. The evidence at the scene was sparse but specific. There were the bare footprints on the ward floor, and then there was the water bottle. The glass bottle was the key. It was a standard 2-quart bottle used to fill the carafes at the patient's bedsides. When the forensics team dusted it, they found several sets of fingerprints. Most were easily identified as belonging to the nursing staff. But there was one set, a full series of prints from a left hand, that did not match anyone authorized to be in that ward. Capstick realized that while he had the killer's calling card, he had no way to identify him. In 1948, there was no national computerized database. Fingerprints were filed manually, and only if the person had a prior criminal record. After checking the records of every known local offender and finding no match, Capstick came to a radical, unprecedented conclusion. If the killer wasn't in the system had to be expanded to include every man in Blackburn. This was the birth of the first mass fingerprinting operation in criminal history. Capstick's plan was staggering in its scale. He intended to fingerprint every male over the age of 16 who had been in the town of Blackburn on the night of the murder. To the modern ear, this sounds like a logistical impossibility, but in the shadow of a child's murder, the community did not protest. They were terrified, and they wanted justice. The police began a door-to-door canvass that would eventually cover over 35,000 homes. They utilized the 1946 Electoral Register and local ration books to ensure no one was missed. Each man was asked to provide a set of prints, which were then compared against the marks found on the water bottle in Ward CH3. Weeks turned into months. The investigation was a grueling marathon of bureaucracy and ink. By July, they had collected over 40,000 sets of prints, and the Great Fingerprint Hunt was becoming a national headline. Yet, the match remained elusive. Skepticism began to grow. Was the killer a drifter? Had he fled the country? Or was he someone so seemingly ordinary that he was hiding in plain sight, waiting for the knock on the door? On August 11th, 1948, 3 months after June's death, a local officer named Frederick Gorton arrived at a house on Burleigh Street. He was there to follow up on a man who had been missed in the initial sweeps because he hadn't been home. The man was Peter Griffiths, a 22-year-old former soldier who worked as a local flour mill hand. Griffiths was polite. He sat down and allowed the officer to take his prints without a hint of hesitation. He seemed like a quiet, unremarkable young man. He lived with his parents and had no history of violence. He didn't fit the profile of a monster. The prints were taken to the makeshift laboratory where experts were working around the clock. When the card for Peter Griffiths was placed under the magnifying glass, the room went still. Every ridge, every whirl, every minutiae of the left-hand prints on the water bottle matched the card from Burleigh Street. Out of 46,253 men fingerprinted, they had found number 46,000 253. When police returned to arrest him, Griffiths didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply looked at the officers and asked, "Is it about the hospital?" In the interrogation room, the story of that night finally emerged. Griffiths claimed he had been drinking heavily. He described a state of aimless wandering, fueled by a dark, surging impulse he couldn't explain. He had scaled the hospital wall, found an open door, and entered the ward. He picked up the water bottle to use as a weapon if he was interrupted, but instead, he used it to steady himself as he reached into the cot. He told the police that June had woken up and started to cry. To stop the noise, he had carried her outside. What followed was a confession of such detached brutality that it sickened even the veteran investigators. He spoke of the assault and the killing as if describing a chore he had been forced to complete. The trial of Peter Griffiths began in October at Lancaster Assizes. The defense attempted to argue a plea of guilty but insane, suggesting that Griffiths suffered from schizophrenia or a temporary psychotic break brought on by his wartime service or his father's history of mental illness. They argued that no man in his right mind could commit such an atrocity against an innocent child. However, the prosecution, led by Toby Lowe, presented a different picture. They pointed to the calculated nature of his actions, the way he had navigated the hospital, the way he had avoided detection, and the fact that he had remained calm and functional for months after the crime. The medical experts for the Crown testified that Griffiths knew exactly what he was doing and that he knew it was wrong. The jury took only 23 minutes to reach a verdict: guilty. Under the laws of the time, there was only one sentence for a crime of this magnitude. On November 19th, 1948, Peter Griffiths was led to the gallows at Walton Prison in Liverpool and executed by hanging. The legacy of the June and Devaney case is twofold. It remains one of the most heartbreaking instances of child murder in British history, a reminder of the fragility of safety even in the most protected spaces. But it also stands as a watershed moment in forensic science. The success of the Blackburn mass fingerprinting proved that forensic evidence could solve unsolvable crimes, leading to the systematic filing and technological advancements that define modern policing today. Once the case was closed, the police did something unusual for the era. They didn't keep the 46,000 fingerprint cards as a permanent database. To honor the trust of the community that had cooperated so willingly, the police publicly burned every single card that did not belong to Peter Griffiths. They wanted the people of Blackburn to know that their privacy was respected and that the only thing that mattered was the one man who had broken the peace of their town. But for the Devaney family, there was no real closure. June was gone, a life extinguished before it had truly begun, leaving behind a story that began in the quiet of a hospital ward and ended by changing the face of justice forever. Next story: the murder of Margaret Cook. London, England, 1946. The fog that rolled through London in the winter of 1946 was more than just a weather pattern. It was the pea souper, a thick yellow-black shroud of coal smoke and industrial grime that turned the city's winding alleys into a labyrinth of shadows. For a city still picking itself up from the rubble of the Blitz, the darkness felt heavy, and the neon lights of the West End provided the only real sense of safety. But in the early hours of November 10th, even the lights of Piccadilly Circus couldn't reach into the narrow mouth of Blue Ball Yard. Margaret Cook was 26 years old, a woman described by friends as vivacious, with a penchant for the nightlife of St. James's. She was known to frequent the Blue Lagoon Club, a place where the music was loud enough to drown out the lingering echoes of air raid sirens. She was a woman of her time, independent, making her way in a city that was rapidly changing. But as she stepped out into the biting cold that Sunday morning, she was being watched. Witnesses would later recall seeing Margaret walking near the entrance of the yard, a small cul-de-sac just off St. James's Street. She wasn't alone. A man followed closely behind her. He was described as being of average build, wearing a dark overcoat that seemed to swallow his frame in the dim light. There was no shouting, no struggle that caught the attention of the few passers-by. There was only the sudden, sharp crack of a pistol, a sound that, in 1946 London, was still terrifyingly familiar. A nearby police officer, hearing the shot, sprinted toward the sound. He found Margaret lying on the cold cobblestones of Blue Ball Yard. A single bullet had struck her in the chest. As the officer knelt beside her, the life fading from her eyes, he caught a glimpse of a figure vanishing into the fog, moving with a chillingly calm, deliberate pace. By the time backup arrived, the killer had been absorbed by the city. The investigation into Margaret Cook's murder was immediate and intense. Scotland Yard took the lead, scouring the yard for evidence. They found a shell casing, a .32 caliber, and a single, chilling clue, a handwritten note in Margaret's handbag. It was a brief, cryptic message that suggested a meeting, but it lacked a signature. The detectives began to pull at the threads of Margaret's life. They discovered she had been living a double life of sorts. While she worked a respectable job during the day, her nights were spent in the company of the underworld characters that populated the West End. She had been seen with several men, some of whom had ties to the black market, a booming industry in post-war Britain where rationing was still a harsh reality. One name kept surfacing in the bars and clubs, a man known only as the Canadian. He was a frequent visitor to the Blue Lagoon and had been seen arguing with Margaret just days before her death. The police launched a manhunt, checking every hotel and boarding house from Soho to Chelsea. They found men who fit the description, but none who could be definitively placed at Blue Ball Yard. The fog had done its job. It hadn't just hidden the killer's face, it had erased his tracks. As weeks turned into months, the case began to grow cold. The sensational headlines that had once screamed, "The Blue Ball Yard Mystery," began to fade, replaced by the mundane struggles of a nation trying to rebuild. From the files of Scotland Yard, the case remained open. Detectives were haunted by the cold-blooded nature of the execution. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. Margaret's jewelry and cash were untouched. This was a professional hit. Years passed, and the 1940s gave way to the 50s. The murder of Margaret Cook became a dark piece of London folklore, a cautionary tale whispered in the corners of St. James's pubs. That was until a startling confession emerged from the most unlikely of places. In the late 1950s, a man named Robert Fabian, known to the public as Fabian of the Yard, retired from the force and began writing about his most famous cases. He revealed that during the investigation, they had come remarkably close to a suspect, a man with ties to a high-ranking official in the diplomatic service. The theory was that Margaret had stumbled upon a secret she wasn't supposed to know, perhaps related to the smuggling of currency or sensitive documents during the transition from war to peace. However, before an arrest could be made, the suspect disappeared, allegedly spirited out of the country by unseen hands. The implication was clear. The murder of Margaret Cook wasn't just a street crime. It was a matter of national security, or at the very least, a cover-up for someone far too important to be hanged at Wandsworth Prison. The gun used in the killing, the .32 caliber pistol, was never recovered. In post-war London, the city was awash with illegal firearms brought back by returning soldiers. It was a ghost gun, impossible to trace, much like the man who fired it. To this day, Blue Ball Yard remains largely unchanged. The cobblestones are still there, tucked away behind the grand storefronts of St. James's. If you stand there on a foggy November night, the silence feels heavy. You can almost hear the echoes of that single shot and the footsteps of a man walking away into the darkness. Margaret Cook was a young woman who wanted to live a full life in a city that had just survived its darkest hour. Instead, she became a footnote in the history of London's unsolved mysteries, a victim of a time when the line between the law and the shadows was as thin as the London fog. The killer was never caught, the motive never fully revealed, and the truth remains buried in the archives of a city that knows how to keep its secrets. Next story, The Secretary and the Senator. Wilmington, Delaware, 1996. In the mid-1990s, the city of Wilmington, Delaware, felt like a small town where everyone who was anyone knew each other. It was a place of high-stakes legal battles, political maneuvering, and a social hierarchy that felt almost impenetrable. At the center of this world was Marie Fahey, at 30 years old, and Marie was the scheduling secretary for Delaware's then governor, Tom Carper. She was widely loved, described by friends and colleagues as vibrant, ambitious, and possessing a smile that could light up the somber hallways of the state capitol. But beneath that polished, professional exterior, Marie was a woman living in fear, entangled in a secret that was slowly suffocating her. The mystery began on the evening of Thursday, June 27th, 1996. Marie had spent the evening having dinner with a man at a local upscale restaurant. To anyone watching, they looked like an unlikely pair, a beautiful, young professional and a powerful, charismatic man nearly 20 years her senior. After dinner, they were seen leaving together. It was the last time anyone would see Marie Fahy alive. When Marie failed to show up for work the following morning, the alarm bells didn't just ring, they screamed. She was notoriously punctual and deeply dedicated to her role in the governor's office. Her family, particularly her brothers, knew instantly that something was wrong. Marie was a creature of habit, and she was in the middle of planning a bright future with her boyfriend, Michael Scanlon. By the time Friday evening rolled around and her apartment sat empty, her family officially reported her missing. The investigation that followed would peel back the layers of Delaware's elite society, revealing a sordid tale of obsession, power, and a narcissism so profound it bordered on the pathological. Police began their search at Marie's apartment. On the surface, nothing seemed out of place. There were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, and no blood. However, investigators noticed a few chilling details. Her purse and keys were missing, but her passport and uncashed paychecks remained. Even more telling was the state of her mental health as reflected in her personal writings. Investigators discovered a series of diary entries that painted a haunting picture of a woman being psychologically tormented. In her journals, Marie wrote about a monster. She described a man who was controlling, manipulative, and who refused to let her go. She wrote about her desperate attempts to end a secret 3-year affair with a prominent figure, a man who had used his status to keep her quiet and his charm to keep her trapped. That man was Thomas Capano. To the public, Tom Capano was the gold standard of success. He was a wealthy lawyer, a former high-ranking state prosecutor, and a political powerhouse who had served as legal counsel to governors. He came from a family of millionaire developers who practically built Wilmington. He was a father, a pillar of the community, and a man who seemed to have everything. But as the FBI and local police began to dig into Capano's life, the mask began to slip. When investigators first interviewed Capano, he was the picture of cooperation, or so it seemed. He admitted to having dinner with Marie on the night she vanished, claiming he dropped her off at her apartment around 10 p.m. and never saw her again. But his story had cracks. He was overly talkative, trying to direct the investigation toward other leads, suggesting Marie might have run away due to her struggles with an eating disorder or stress. However, the forensic evidence began to tell a different story. While Capano's home appeared pristine, investigators found that he had recently replaced a large section of carpet in his great room. He had also conveniently disposed of a large sofa. When they tracked down his brothers, the case took a turn into the truly macabre. The Capano family was tight-knit, bound by blood and business, but the pressure of a federal investigation began to fracture the foundation. Tom's brother, Gerard Capano, eventually broke under the weight of his own conscience and the threat of life in prison. He told investigators a story that sounded like something out of a noir thriller. According to Gerard, Tom had shown up at his house in a state of agitation shortly after Marie disappeared. Tom told him that an extortionist had been killed in his home and that he needed help disposing of a body. On the morning of June 28th, the two brothers took Tom's boat, a 25-foot vessel named Summer Wind, out into the Atlantic Ocean, about 60 miles off the coast of New Jersey. Gerard described a scene of cold-blooded efficiency. He watched as his brother hauled a large, heavy cooling chest onto the deck. When the chest wouldn't sink because of the air trapped inside, Tom became frustrated. In a moment of chilling pragmatism, Tom took a shotgun and fired holes into the cooler, but it still refused to stay under the waves. Ultimately, Gerard claimed, Tom removed the body from the cooler, weighed it down with a heavy anchor from the boat, and pushed Marie Fahey into the dark waters of the Atlantic. They then tossed the empty cooler overboard and headed back to shore. The betrayal of his brother was the smoking gun, but the prosecution still faced a monumental challenge. They had no body. In the history of Delaware, no one had ever been convicted of first-degree murder without a corpse. As the trial began in 1998, the courtroom became a theater of the bizarre. Thomas Capano, ever the egoist, insisted on testifying in his own defense. It was a move that legal experts called a disaster. Instead of the charming, wrong man he hoped to portray, the jury saw a man who was arrogant, condescending, and prone to outbursts. He admitted to the affair, but tried to pin the actual accidental death on another one of his mistresses, Linda Fairstein, claiming she had broken into his house and accidentally shot Anne-Marie in a jealous rage. It was a story so convoluted and lacked so much evidence that it served only to alienate the jury further. The prosecution, however, had a secret weapon, the cooler. Months after the disappearance, a fisherman had discovered a large, white Coleman cooler floating in the ocean. It was riddled with buckshot holes. When it was brought into the courtroom, the silence was deafening. Gerard Capano identified it as the one they had used. Forensic teams found a small trace of blood on the interior that matched Anne-Marie's DNA. The picture painted for the jury was one of a psychological predator. Tom Capano couldn't handle the fact that Anne-Marie was finally gaining the strength to leave him. She had started seeing a therapist, she was in a healthy relationship with Michael Scanlon, and she was beginning to see Capano for what he truly was, a narcissist who used people as playthings. When he realized he could no longer control her, he decided that if he couldn't have her, no one would. The trial lasted for weeks, becoming a national sensation. It exposed the underbelly of Wilmington's elite, showing how wealth and influence were used to cover up a lifetime of infidelity and manipulation. Capano's defense team tried to argue that there was no proof of a murder, only a disappearance, but the mountain of circumstantial evidence. The blood in the cooler, the missing carpet, the brother's testimony, and Anne-Marie's own word from the grave in her diary was insurmountable. In January 1999, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Thomas Capano, the man who once walked the halls of power, was sentenced to death. The case didn't end there, though. Because of various appeals and changes in Delaware's death penalty laws, Capano's sentence was eventually commuted to life in prison. He spent the rest of his days in a maximum security facility, a far cry from the mansions and country clubs he was accustomed to. He died of a heart attack in his cell in 2011, taking many of the specific details of that final night with him. The body of Anne-Marie Fahey was never recovered. The Atlantic Ocean kept it secret despite extensive searches. For her family, there was no grave to visit, only the memories of a woman whose life was cut short just as she was finding her voice. Next story, the Bobby Greenlease kidnapping. Kansas City, Missouri, 1953. On a crisp September morning in 1953, the French Institute of Notre Dame de Deschamps in Kansas City was settling into its usual academic routine. At approximately 11 a.m., a woman dressed in a well-tailored navy suit walked through the front doors. She presented herself with an air of quiet urgency, identifying herself as the aunt of 6-year-old Bobby Greenlease. She told the sister in charge a heartbreaking story. Bobby's mother had suffered a sudden, massive heart attack while shopping, and she was there to take the boy to the hospital immediately. The school, moved by the woman's apparent distress and the gravity of the emergency, did not hesitate. They called for Bobby. The young boy, described by many as bright-eyed and trusting, was led to the front office. When he saw the woman, he didn't seem to recognize her, but in the confusion of a family emergency, a child's hesitation is often overlooked. He took her hand, walked out the front doors, and climbed into a blue station wagon. That was the last time Bobby Greenlease was seen alive by anyone who cared for him. Bobby was not just any child. He was the son of Robert Cosgrove Greenlease Sr., a man who had built an empire as one of the largest Cadillac dealers in the United States. In 1953, The Greenlease name was synonymous with wealth and the American dream. But that dream was about to turn into a living nightmare. Shortly after Bobby was taken, the school contacted the Greenlease home to check on the mother's condition. When a perfectly healthy Mrs. Greenlease answered the phone, the world collapsed. The realization was instantaneous. Bobby had been kidnapped. While the Greenlease family and the FBI began their frantic search, the perpetrators were already putting the next phase of their plan into motion. The woman in the Navy suit was Bonnie Emily Brown Hetty, and her partner in the crime was Carl Austin Hall. Hall was the mastermind, a man who had squandered a $200,000 inheritance on booze and bad investments, and was now desperate to reclaim his status through the most ruthless means possible. Despite the snatch going exactly as planned, Hall's desperation was eclipsed only by his cruelty. Less than an hour after picking Bobby up from school, Hall drove the boy across the state line into Kansas. In a secluded field, the unthinkable happened. Hall had originally intended to use a heavy-moving blanket to stifle the boy, but when that proved difficult, he used a small-caliber pistol. Bobby Greenlease was killed almost immediately, long before the first ransom note ever reached his father's doorstep. For the next several days, the Greenlease family was subjected to a psychological torture that few can imagine. Hall and Hetty began a series of communications, demanding the largest ransom in American history at that time, $600,000 in cash. In today's economy, that sum would be equivalent to over $7 million. The kidnappers were meticulous and cold. They sent letters and made phone calls, providing just enough detail to keep the family's hope alive while refusing any proof of life that wasn't general or easily faked. They instructed Robert Greenlease to pack the money into 2 duffel bags. The ransom was to be paid in $10 and $20 bills, making the physical weight of the cash immense, nearly 85 pounds of paper. Robert Greenlease, desperate to see his son again, complied with every demand. On the night of October 4th, following a complex set of instructions involving coded messages and remote drop-off points, the bags of cash were left near a bridge in a rural area. Hall and Hetty retrieved the money and fled to St. Louis. With the largest ransom in history in their possession, the duo should have disappeared. But Carl Hall was not a master criminal. He was a desperate man with a mounting addiction to alcohol and a penchant for drawing attention to himself. The pair checked into a nondescript apartment in St. Louis, but Hall's behavior was erratic. He began spending large sums of money almost immediately. He ditched Bonnie Hetty at the apartment and took a large portion of the ransom money, roughly half of it, and moved into a high-end hotel. He began buying expensive suits and hiring high-priced sex workers, drinking heavily and acting like a man who had suddenly struck gold. His undoing came in the form of a suspicious taxi driver and a police officer who noticed Hall's bizarre behavior and the sheer volume of cash he was carrying in his suitcases. When Hall was brought in for questioning, he initially tried to bribe the officers with thousands of dollars. It was a fatal mistake. The police, sensing something much larger than a simple case of public intoxication or bribery, contacted the FBI. Back at the apartment, police found Bonnie Hetty. She was passed out, surrounded by empty bottles and the remnants of their brief, grisly victory. Under interrogation, the duo's story quickly unraveled. On October 7th, Hall led investigators to the backyard of Bonnie Hetty's home in St. Joseph, Missouri. There, beneath a freshly planted bed of chrysanthemums, they found the shallow grave of Bobby Greenlease. The news sent a shockwave through the nation. The brutality of the crime, killing a child within an hour of the kidnapping and then continuing to extort the grieving parents for days, was seen as a new low in American delinquency. However, as the investigation into the recovery of the ransom began, a second mystery emerged, one that remains unsolved to this day. When Hall was arrested, he had approximately $300,000 of the ransom money in his possession, but $300,000 was missing. Hall claimed that the police who arrested him had stolen it. The 2 arresting officers, Lieutenant Joe Lewis McKnight and Elmer Burkle, were eventually investigated and brought to trial. While there was significant evidence of corruption and many believed they had made off with the missing bags of cash, the money was never found, and the officers were never convicted of the theft. The missing Greenlease ransom became an enduring legend in St. Louis folklore, with rumors of buried treasure and secret offshore accounts persisting for decades. The legal proceedings for Hall and Hetty moved with a speed that is unheard of in the modern justice system. Public outrage was so intense that there was no room for delay. Both defendants pleaded guilty. Just 79 days after Bobby was taken from his school, Carl Austin Hall and Bonnie Emily Brown Hetty were led into the gas chamber at the Missouri State Penitentiary. They were executed side by side in the same chamber on December 18, 1953. It remains one of the few instances in U.S. history where a man and a woman were executed together for the same crime. The Bobby Greenlease case changed the way America viewed kidnapping. It led to stricter security protocols in schools across the country and a renewed focus on the Lindbergh Law, ensuring that kidnapping across state lines remained a federal offense punishable by death. But for the Greenlease family, no amount of justice or legislative change could fill the void left by the boy in the blue station wagon. The Cadillac empire continued, but the name Greenlease would forever be associated with a tragedy that proved that even the most immense wealth could not provide a shield against the darkness of human greed.